there is a story every Freemason knows. A London jeweller, a Portuguese dungeon, 9 sessions of torture, and a man who refused to break. It is a story about silence, about the sacred duty to protect a brotherhood's deepest secrets, even when iron chains are crushing your ribcage, even when your shoulders are being wrenched from their sockets, even when the only thing standing between you and the fire is your willingness to speak. For nearly 3 centuries, this story has been told in lodge halls from Edinburgh to Sao Paulo, from Philadelphia to Bombay. It has been translated into a dozen languages. It has made its hero, a middling jeweller named John Kustos, into one of the most celebrated martyrs in the history of secret societies. There is just one problem. Almost none of it is true. And the gap between what John Kustos claimed and what actually happened tells you more about Freemasonry, about what it is, why it endures, and why it frightens people, than any confession ever extracted in a torture chamber. Chapter 1. The Jeweller and the Torture Chamber. How a Lie Defined Freemasonry. On the 14th of March, 1743, John Kustos stepped out of a Lisbon coffeehouse and into the rest of his life. He was 40 years old, a respectable London craftsman who dealt in fine jewellery, a man of modest fame and considerable self-regard. He had been living in Lisbon for some time, working his trade, moving in the circles that a man of his profession and social ambition tended to move in. Those circles included Freemasons. Within minutes of leaving that coffeehouse, Kustos found himself seized by men he did not know, placed in irons and pushed into a carriage. The destination was a building at the northern edge of Rossio Square, the Estaus Palace, headquarters of the Portuguese Holy Office of the Inquisition. It was one of the most feared institutions in the Christian world, and its walls had absorbed the screams of hundreds of men and women before him. When Kustos arrived, they shaved his head. They stripped off his outer clothes. They put him in a cell where silence was enforced by violence. A prisoner who coughed too loudly was beaten unconscious. He was allowed no contact with family or friends, no books, not even a Bible. The point of this isolation was deliberate and carefully considered. In the absence of all external distraction, the imagination would supply its own horrors. The mind, left alone with the possibility of what the Inquisition could do, would begin to do the Inquisition's work for it. The charge against Kustos was formal and specific. He had joined the Freemasons in open defiance of a papal bull issued 5 years earlier by Pope Clement XII, the same pope who commissioned the Trevi Fountain in Rome. That bull, issued in 1738, had excommunicated all Freemasons and tasked the Inquisition with discovering what went on behind the lodge's closed doors. Kustos, the Inquisition declared, had willfully participated in a society marked by blasphemy, sodomy, and every conceivable moral abomination, and then had refused to reveal its true intentions and secret plans to the court. What followed, according to Kustos himself, was a journey through the full machinery of inquisitorial torture. He described being bound horizontally on a rack, an iron collar locked around his throat, ropes wound twice around each limb, and then pulled until they cut through skin and drew blood. He described being lifted with his arms twisted behind his back until his shoulders dislocated and he vomited blood. He described a third ordeal in which chains were wrapped around his torso and tightened by pulley until his internal organs were compressed and his wrists and arms wrenched from their joints. 9 separate sessions of torment, he claimed, over the course of 16 months in a windowless dungeon beneath the Estaus Palace. On the 21st of June, 1744, he was finally brought before the Inquisition's auto da fe, the public ceremony of judgment. 8 of his fellow prisoners were burned alive. Kustos, at the last moment, was shown mercy. 4 years rowing a galley ship as a slave. His friends in England, hearing of his plight, intervened through diplomatic channels. He was released. On the 15th of December, 1744, he returned to London, and then he wrote a book. The timing was perfect, though not entirely accidental. In 1745, the Jacobite rebellion erupted across Scotland. Bonnie Prince Charlie raised his standard in the Highlands and marched south, and for a brief, terrifying season, it seemed as though a Catholic claimant might retake the British throne. The rebellion failed, but it inflamed Protestant England's appetite for stories of Roman Catholic barbarism. A tale about an Englishman tortured by the Inquisition for the crime of joining a brotherhood that stood for fellowship and tolerance and moral self-improvement, was exactly what the market wanted. The Sufferings of John Kustos for Freemasonry was published with engravings of the very instruments used to torment its author. It was translated into multiple languages. It was still being reprinted into the 19th century. Kustos became famous. He became a symbol. He became, in the telling of Freemasonry's own historians, one of the great martyrs of the craft, a man who endured unimaginable suffering rather than betray his brothers. The image was powerful, and it was durable, because it answered a question that has always hovered over Freemasonry like smoke over a campfire. What are they hiding, and why? Kustos supplied the answer in the form of a story. They are hiding something precious and important. They are hiding it because it is worth protecting, and some of them, the truest and the bravest, are willing to suffer in its defense. It was a beautiful story. It was almost entirely false. More than 2 centuries after Kustos walked out of that Lisbon dungeon, historians gained access to the actual records of his interrogation, the Inquisition's own meticulous documentation of everything that was said in that windowless room. What they found was not what Kustos had led the world to believe. The record shows that Kustos, confronted with his first serious questioning, did not resist. He did not heroically deflect. He did not invoke the sacred oaths of brotherhood and fall silent. He talked, at length, with considerable thoroughness. He revealed the rituals. He described the gestures. He explained the passwords. He disclosed the symbolic objects used in lodge ceremonies, the meaning of the black and white checkered floor, the purpose of the 3 candles on the altar, the nature of the oath sworn on the volume of sacred law. Everything the Portuguese inquisitors wanted to know, Kustos told them. The document does not show a man who chose silence over suffering. It shows a man who understood, with admirable clarity, that talking was the sensible option. This does not mean he was not tortured. He was. The Inquisition's torturers did not need a reason. The law gave them essentially unlimited discretion, and they used it. Kustos was subjected to 2 sessions of physical torment, each lasting just over 15 minutes. This was real pain, real suffering, real fear. But neither session involved the full horror he described in his book. The strappado, the dislocation of both shoulders, was not used. The chain torture is not mentioned in the official record. There is something else Kustos did not mention in his account. At the time of his imprisonment, a pamphlet called Masonry Dissected, written by a man named Sam Pritchard, had already been publicly available in England for over a decade. It contained, in clear and readable form, most of what the Portuguese inquisitors were so desperate to learn. The secrets of Freemasonry were, at that moment, not particularly secret. Anyone sufficiently motivated could have walked into a bookshop in London and purchased the answers the Inquisition was trying to extract through violence. Kustos knew all of this. He chose to tell a different story. Why does this matter? Because what Kustos did, and what generations of Freemasons did when they retold and embellished his story, reveals something fundamental about the way Freemasonry works. Not the rituals, not the handshakes, not the passwords, something deeper. The secret of Freemasonry was never really the content of the rituals. Any dedicated outsider, at almost any point in the organization's history, could find out what the passwords were, what the gestures meant, what happened behind the lodge's closed doors. Books were published, former members talked, inquisitors extracted confessions. The real secret of Freemasonry was the idea that there was a secret worth protecting. That idea, the suggestion of hidden knowledge, of important truths accessible only to initiated brothers, of a mystery at the core of the craft, was what gave the organization its magnetic pull. It was what made men want to join. It was what made men feel, once they had joined, that they belonged to something significant. And it was what made outsiders suspicious, frightened, and sometimes violently hostile. Kustos understood this instinctively, even if he would not have explained it in these terms. As a prisoner in Lisbon, he spoke everything he knew to the men who held him captive. As an author in London, he understood that the story of a man who said nothing, who endured rack and chain rather than betray his brothers, was infinitely more valuable than the truth. He sold the idea of Freemasonry more effectively than any honest memoir ever could. And the inquisitors, for their part, played their role perfectly. In the torturer's logic, if you had nothing to hide, you would not try so hard to hide it. They provided Freemasonry with the most compelling advertisement possible, proof that what lay inside the lodge was worth suffering for. To understand why a pope would excommunicate an entire brotherhood and set the Inquisition upon its members, you need to understand just how strange Freemasonry looked to the established powers of the 18th century world. It was, first of all, English. In an age when England meant constitutional monarchy, parliamentary government, a free press, and a degree of political openness that struck most European courts as barely distinguishable from anarchy, anything that arrived from across the English Channel wearing English clothes was automatically suspect. Freemasons might be spies. They almost certainly harboured dangerous ideas. It was, second, international. Freemasons claimed to be citizens of the world, bound to one another by ties of brotherhood that transcended national loyalty, religious confession, and social rank. In a world organised around the absolute authority of kings and the absolute truth of the Church, this was not a philosophical position. It was a provocation. It was, third, genuinely mixed. The lodges of the 18th century contained craftsmen alongside aristocrats, merchants beside lawyers, Jews beside Christians, the occasional African beside the occasional duke. Not in a spirit of radical equality, Freemasonry was never that, but in a manner that blurred the God-given hierarchy that the Church insisted was the foundation of civilized order. The lodge's practice of wearing gloves during rituals, so that, as Freemasons like to say, no man could distinguish a duke's hand from a labourer's, was not subversion. But it was unsettling, and it had secrets. The Inquisitor's question to Kustos echoes across the centuries, with a logic that is, in its own way, unassailable. If the Society of Freemasons is truly as virtuous and harmless as you claim, why does it take such elaborate precautions to hide itself? The Freemasons' answer, "We are not a secret society, we are merely a society with secrets," has always been less than satisfying. Because the moment you announce that you have a secret, nothing you do with complete openness will put the matter to rest. There will always be those who assume that the secret is the truth, and the openness is the performance. This is the trap that Freemasonry built for itself at the very beginning of its history, and has never managed to escape. The story of John Kustos is where this history begins, not because he was Freemasonry's first member, nor its most important, nor its most honest, but because his story contains, in concentrated form, everything that has made Freemasonry simultaneously fascinating and dangerous for the 4 centuries of its existence. The promise of hidden knowledge, the drama of initiation into an exclusive brotherhood, the suspicion of enemies, the mythology of the noble martyr, the gap between what the organisation says it is and what outsiders fear it might be, the way secrecy feeds both loyalty and paranoia, the way a story, told well enough, can outlast the truth it was designed to replace. By the time Kustos returned to London, Freemasonry had already spread far beyond the English coffeehouses and tavern rooms where it was born. It had crossed the English Channel. It had reached the American colonies. It was beginning to find its way into the courts of European monarchs. Within a generation, it would help shape a revolution in France and consecrate a republic in America. Within 2 centuries, it would count kings and presidents and composers and revolutionaries among its members, and would be blamed, by its enemies, for orchestrating the destruction of the old world order. None of that is as simple as either the Brotherhood's admirers or its enemies would have you believe. What follows is the real story. It begins, as all the best stories do, with a man who was braver in his telling than he was in his living, and who, in that gap between truth and myth, accidentally revealed the deepest secret Freemasonry ever kept. Chapter 2. The drama on the black and white floor. What really happens inside a lodge. Imagine you have agreed to something you do not fully understand. A friend, a trusted one, a man whose judgment you respect, has told you that there is a brotherhood, that it is serious, that it will change the way you see yourself and the world, that it asks something difficult of you before it gives you anything in return. You have said yes. And now you are standing in a corridor outside a closed door, and a man you have never met is asking you to hand over everything metal you are carrying, your coins, your keys, the watch your father gave you. A cord is being looped over your head like a noose. Your left sleeve is being rolled up. Your right trouser leg is being raised to the knee. Someone is pressing a blindfold over your eyes. You cannot see, you can only listen. And what you hear, from behind that door, is silence. You take one step forward. Your life as a Freemason has begun. Before we go any further into that room, we need to stop and address something directly. Freemasonry's rituals have been mocked for as long as they have existed. Satirists in the 18th century drew cartoons of grown men in aprons, making elaborate hand gestures at one another. 20th century comedians played lodges for laughs. Even today, the image of middle-aged professionals solemnly reenacting the murder of a biblical architect while wearing ceremonial regalia strikes most outsiders as faintly absurd. The mockery is easy. It is also, in a deeper sense, a form of evasion, because what Freemasonry understood, and what its critics have consistently failed to understand, is that ritual is not the opposite of serious. It is the infrastructure of serious. Every society that has ever functioned has been built on ritual. We applaud at the end of performances, we stand for national anthems, we wear black to funerals and white to weddings. We shake hands when we meet strangers and embrace friends we have not seen in years. These are rituals. We do not think of them as rituals because we perform them without thinking, but that automaticity is precisely what makes them powerful. Ritual does not require belief to function. It functions by repetition, by shared experience, by the creation of a common reference frame between people who might otherwise have nothing in common. What Freemasonry did, with unusual deliberateness, was to take this human instinct and design around it. To create rituals that were explicitly about transformation, that told a man, in the clearest possible symbolic language, that he was crossing a threshold, leaving something behind, and becoming something new. Whether that transformation was real depended entirely on the man who underwent it. But the ritual was designed to make it feel real, and in the feeling, most of the time, lay something genuine. The blindfolded candidate is led into the lodge room. He is guided across that famous black and white checkered floor, a pattern that, in the time of John Kustos, was often drawn in chalk each meeting and erased afterward. He is brought to his knees before an altar. He is asked to state that he believes in God, in any form. The Freemasons have always called this figure the Grand Architect of the Universe, and the studied vagueness of the title is not an accident. It is a deliberate act of inclusion. Christian, Jew, Muslim, deist, any man who acknowledged some higher ordering principle of the cosmos could place his hand on his own sacred text and take the oath in good conscience. The oath itself is where things become interesting. The candidate swears that he will not write down the secrets he is about to receive, will not communicate them to the uninitiated, will not reveal them under any pressure. And then, this is the part that has alarmed outsiders for centuries, he describes, in graphic detail, the punishment that will befall him if he breaks his word. His throat will be cut, his tongue will be torn out. His body will be buried at the low water mark of the shore, where the tide rises and falls twice in every 24 hours. He swears this, he means it, or, at least, he is expected to mean it. The oath completed, the blindfold is removed. This moment, and the lodges have always understood its theatrical importance, is designed to be overwhelming. After the darkness of the blindfold, the room feels brilliantly lit. The candidate sees for the first time the assembled brothers seated along the walls of the rectangular hall, watching him with expressions of grave benevolence. He sees the 3 candles on the altar, arranged on small classical columns, one Corinthian, one Ionic, one Doric. He sees the 2 freestanding pillars, each topped with a globe. He sees the officers of the lodge in their places, wearing aprons and regalia he does not yet fully understand. Then the master of the lodge explains what he is seeing. The 3 candles represent the 3 guides of his Masonic life. The sun, which rules the day, the moon, which rules the night, and the master of the lodge, who governs the work of the brothers. The black and white floor represents the alternation of light and shadow in human existence, joy and grief, knowledge and ignorance, life and death. The 2 pillars flanking the entrance are named Boaz and Jachin, the names given in the Book of Kings to the columns at the entrance of Solomon's temple. Boaz means strength, Jachin means establishment. Everything in the room means something. Everything is a symbol pointing toward a moral reality. And then comes the secret, the thing this whole elaborate ceremony has been building toward. The candidate is taught 3 things. A sign, the right hand drawn across the throat, a reminder of the penalty sworn in the oath. A grip, the handshake, in which the thumb of one hand presses the first knuckle of the other's index finger. This is the means by which a Freemason can identify a brother anywhere in the world, and confirm that a stranger is genuinely what he claims to be. A word, Boaz, The name of the pillar, the symbol of strength. It is never to be spoken aloud in full, only spelled. The candidate learns to spell it rather than pronounce it, so that even the utterance of the secret has been emptied of complete meaning. He receives his apron, lambskin, white, the symbol of innocence and the badge of a Mason. He takes his place among his brothers, and then he waits, sometimes for months, before the second degree. The second degree, the fellowcraft, follows the same essential structure as the first, but with deliberate inversions. Where the candidate for the first degree bared his left knee and left breast, the fellowcraft bears his right. Where the first handshake pressed the index finger's knuckle, the second presses the middle fingers. The penalty oath involves not the cutting of a throat, but the tearing out of the heart, which will be given to the birds of prey. The moral lessons of the second degree shift from basic virtue to something more expansive. The candidate is encouraged not merely to be a good man, but to understand the world around him. The emphasis falls on knowledge, on the 7 liberal arts and sciences, on the geometry that underlies all creation, on the idea that self-improvement is not merely a personal duty but a cosmic one. The initiated fellowcraft is expected to look outward, to study, to grow, but it is the third degree, the Master Mason, that is the true culmination of the experience, the degree that contains Freemasonry's most closely guarded secret, the degree that has been generating equal parts awe and bewilderment since the 18th century. It is a play, a short one, about 12 minutes long when performed at full pace, considerably longer when drawn out with the solemnity the occasion demands, but a play nonetheless, with actors, a script, a set, and a death. The story goes like this. Solomon, king of Israel, has commissioned the building of his great temple. The chief architect of that temple is a man named Hiram Abif, a master craftsman of extraordinary skill, the only man in the world who knows all 3 of the master's secrets: the word, the grip, and the sign by which a master mason may be recognized. 3 of the temple's workers, fellow craftsmen who have not yet achieved the rank of master, decide to compel Hiram to reveal these secrets. They ambush him at the 3 gates of the temple. The first strikes him across the throat with a rule. Hiram refuses to speak. The second strikes him across the chest with a square. Hiram still refuses. The third strikes him across the head with a maul. Hiram Abif falls dead. The 3 murderers bury the body in a shallow grave on a hill outside Jerusalem, marking it with a sprig of acacia, which in Masonic symbolism represents the immortality of the soul. When the body is discovered missing, Solomon sends search parties. The grave is eventually found. And then the assembled brothers of the lodge, the candidate among them, playing the role of Hiram himself, perform the ancient raising. The body is lifted from the grave using the grip of the first degree, which slips, then using the grip of the second, which also slips. Finally, using the grip of the Master Mason, the grip of the lion's paw, the full hand-to-hand clasp, Hiram Abif is raised to stand upright before his king. The candidate, who has been lying on the floor of the lodge wrapped in a cloth, is lifted to his feet. He has died, symbolically, as an uninitiated man. He has been raised as a Master Mason. The word that was lost with Hiram's death, the true Master's word that died with him, is replaced with a substitute. The true word, according to the ritual, will not be recovered until the temple is rebuilt. What the new Master receives is Mahabone, a word whose exact meaning is uncertain, but which is given as the lodge door stands open, a substitute for something irretrievably lost, a reminder that the most important knowledge is always, in some sense, incomplete. Sit with the Hiram Abif story for a moment, because it is more carefully constructed than it appears. The narrative does 3 things simultaneously, and it does them all with considerable psychological sophistication. First, it creates a shared experience of death and rebirth. Every Master Mason has lain on that floor. Every Master Mason has been lifted by that grip. The physical act of lying down and rising creates a memory that is not merely intellectual. It is stored in the body. 30 years later, a Mason who has not attended a lodge meeting in a decade will still remember what it felt like to be raised. That memory is a bond that no amount of time can entirely dissolve. Second, it encodes a lesson about the price of silence. Hiram Abif is killed precisely because he refuses to speak. He is the ultimate expression of the idea that some knowledge is worth dying for, which is of course the idea that John Kustos claimed to embody in his Lisbon dungeon. and which gave his story its lasting power. The myth and the man, separated by centuries and an ocean, are telling the same story for the same reason. Third, and this is the cleverest part, it explains why the secret cannot be revealed. The true master's word was lost with Hiram. What the candidate receives is a substitute. So even if he wanted to betray the ultimate secret of Freemasonry, he cannot, because no one alive possesses it. The secret is, definitionally, incomplete. The keeper of the secret has already been murdered. This is a remarkable piece of narrative engineering. It solves, in one stroke, the oldest problem of any secret society. How do you maintain the power of a secret when the secret has already leaked? The Freemasons' answer is to make the secret's incompleteness part of its meaning. The lodge does not claim to possess the lost word. It claims to be searching for it. And the search itself, the ongoing, never-completed quest for moral and spiritual knowledge, is the point. When the ceremony ends, and the ceremonies are long, the third degree in particular taking well over an hour, the lodge closes with its own ritual. More gestures, more prayers, more solemn words. And then something very human. The brothers eat together. They drink, they talk, they laugh. In the 18th and 19th centuries, these festive dinners were famous for their enthusiasm and their duration. Songs were sung. The lodges maintained extensive collections of Masonic songs, some solemn, some ribald, most somewhere in between. Toasts were proposed in a specific order, to the grand architect of the universe, to the grand master, to the absent brethren, to the wives and sweethearts of the members. The wine flowed. This is the part that tends to get left out of both the admiring accounts and the suspicious ones. The ritual was serious, but the Brotherhood was convivial. Men joined Freemasonry for many reasons: spiritual hunger, social ambition, philosophical curiosity, the desire to belong to something larger than themselves. But they stayed, in large part because it was pleasant to meet regularly with men they respected and trusted, to share a meal, to feel the specific warmth of a community that had admitted them deliberately and expected something of them in return. The secrets, the handshake, the password, the oath were not the substance of Freemasonry. They were the membrane around the substance. They created the boundaries of the community. They defined who was inside and who was outside, and in the act of defining that boundary, they gave the inside its value. This is, in the end, what the Portuguese inquisitors could never quite understand, and what John Kustos, even in his fabrications, was trying to explain. The secret of Freemasonry is not a piece of information. It is a feeling, the feeling of being one of the ones who know, the feeling of brotherhood with men who have undergone the same experience, spoken the same words, felt the same cord loop around their necks in the darkness outside the lodge door. The feeling, however briefly and imperfectly achieved, of belonging to something serious in a world that rarely demands seriousness. That feeling is not nothing. In the right circumstances, at the right moment in a man's life, it is quite a lot. It is, in fact, enough to build an empire on. And in the century that follows, the 18th century, the great age of Masonic expansion, that is precisely what it will be used for. Chapter 3, From Stonecutters to Statesmen, the birth of a global brotherhood. Here is something that should stop you cold. The most influential secret society in the history of the modern world. An organization that would count kings, presidents, composers, revolutionaries, and emperors among its members, began in a tavern. Not a grand hall, not an ancient temple, not a candlelit chamber beneath a medieval castle. A tavern in London, probably smelling of pipe smoke and spilled ale, almost certainly noisy, and attended by a group of men whose most remarkable quality, at that particular moment, was that they had nothing especially remarkable about them. The year was 1717. The place was the Goose and Gridiron Ale House in St. Paul's Churchyard, and on a June evening, 4 London lodges of Freemasons gathered together, elected a Grand Master, declared themselves the premier Grand Lodge of England, and, without fully realising what they were doing, set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the social and political landscape of the modern world. But to understand what happened in that tavern, and why it mattered, you need to go back much further, back to the stone itself. In the great age of cathedral building, the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, the men who cut and placed the stone were not ordinary labourers. They were specialists of a rare and valuable kind. The mathematics required to design a Gothic arch, the engineering knowledge needed to raise a vaulted ceiling without bringing the whole structure down, the ability to read architectural plans and translate them into precise cuts of stone, these were skills that took years to acquire and that could not easily be replaced. Because their skills were so specialised, and because the great building projects of the medieval period, cathedrals, castles, monasteries, moved from site to site as they were completed, the stonemasons developed a distinctive professional culture. They travelled. They were, in the language of the time, Freemasons, free to move between cities and kingdoms in a way that most medieval workers were not, because their trade gave them a value that transcended the boundaries of any particular lord's estate. To protect their trade, they organised. Every major building site had a lodge, a physical structure, sometimes temporary, where the masons gathered to eat, to rest, to store their tools, and to conduct the business of their craft. In these lodges, the masters taught the apprentices. Decisions about working conditions were made, the standards of the craft were maintained, and, crucially, the secrets of the craft were guarded. Not mystical secrets, practical ones. The geometric formulas needed to calculate the proportions of an arch, the methods for testing the quality of stone, the techniques for carving certain decorative elements. These were the competitive advantages of the trade, and they were passed from master to apprentice under conditions of deliberate secrecy. To enforce that secrecy, to distinguish genuine craftsmen from those who merely claimed the skills without possessing them, the lodges developed a system of recognition, signs, grips, words. The means by which a travelling mason, arriving at a new building site in a foreign city, could prove to the men already working there that he was what he claimed to be. This is the raw material from which Freemasonry was made, not the philosophy, not the elaborate ritual drama of Hiram Abif, not the black and white floor or the symbolic tools. Those came later, and we will see how. What existed in the medieval lodges was something much simpler, a practical system of professional identification, belonging to men who did hard, skilled, necessary work in stone. The pivot point, the moment when the stonemason's lodge begins its long transformation into the philosophical brotherhood we recognise as Freemasonry, occurs not in England but in Scotland, and not in a building site but in a royal court. In 1598, the Scottish stonemasons underwent a formal reorganisation under the influence of William Shaw, the Master of Works to King James VI of Scotland. Shaw was a man of Renaissance sensibility, educated, curious, interested in the new currents of humanist thought that were flowing through Europe. His statutes, issued in 1598 and 1599, transformed the loose network of Scottish lodges into something with a clearer organisational structure and, crucially, with an expanded sense of its own purpose. Under Shaw's influence, the Scottish lodges began to develop the idea that their craft carried a deeper significance. The tools of the stonemason, the square, the compass, the level, began to acquire symbolic meaning. The ability to build in stone became a metaphor for the ability to build in character. A man who could cut stone to perfect angles could, the argument went, also be expected to live his life with precision and integrity. And then something happened that would prove decisive. The Scottish lodges began admitting men who were not stonemasons. These men, aristocrats, lawyers, intellectuals, men of fashion and political connection, had no practical use for the secrets of the stonemason's trade. They were not going to appear at a building site and need to prove their professional credentials. What they were interested in was something else entirely: the community, the symbolism, the sense of belonging to a brotherhood with ancient roots and esoteric knowledge. They are called, in the historical literature, accepted masons. Men accepted into the lodge not by virtue of their craft, but by virtue of their character and their interest in what the lodge represented, and their arrival transformed the institution irrevocably. The lodges began to acquire a new population with new expectations. The practical secrets of the stonemason remained, the signs, the grips, the words, but they were increasingly overlaid with philosophical content, moral symbolism, and an elaborate mythology about the ancient origins of the craft. By the time this Scottish model crossed the border into England in the early 17th century, the stonemason's lodge had become something hybrid, part trade organisation, part gentleman's club, part philosophical society, part theatrical ritual space. It was waiting, in this hybrid form, for someone to give it a definitive shape. The man most responsible for giving Freemasonry that definitive shape was a Presbyterian minister from the Scottish borders named James Anderson. He is not a glamorous figure. He was a moderately successful London clergyman with a talent for organisation and an appetite for historical mythology that exceeded his respect for historical accuracy. In 1723, Anderson published The Constitutions of the Freemasons, a founding document for the newly established Premier Grand Lodge of England. It was part rulebook, part origin myth, and part philosophical manifesto. The Constitutions explained, among other things, that Freemasonry had been founded by the builders of Solomon's Temple, passed down through the architects of ancient Greece and Rome, preserved through the Middle Ages by the great cathedral builders, and now reconstituted in its proper form by the lodges of England. Almost none of the historical claims were accurate, but the Constitutions did something far more important than establish accurate history. They established a framework, a set of rules and principles around which the rapidly growing organisation could cohere. The document declared that Freemasons would practice a religion in which all men agree, meaning they would acknowledge God, but would not fight about which God or which theology. It declared that Freemasons would not discuss politics in the lodge. It declared that all men, regardless of social rank, were equal within the lodge walls. These were radical ideas, stated calmly, in a document that presented them as ancient tradition, and they were electrifying. In the decades immediately following 1717, Freemasonry spread across Britain and into Europe at a pace that astonished even its own members. The reasons were multiple and mutually reinforcing. The newly restructured Grand Lodge offered something genuinely valuable, a network of trusted acquaintances that transcended the usual boundaries of class, profession, and sectarian religion. In a world where who you knew determined almost everything about what you could accomplish, the Masonic Lodge was an extraordinarily efficient social machine. It was also, importantly, fashionable. The earliest Grand Masters of English Freemasonry were aristocrats, and the social cachet they brought to the institution attracted other men of rank and influence. But the genius of the Masonic model was that rank and influence, while they might accelerate a man's advancement within the lodge, did not define membership. A duke sat in lodge with a merchant. An Anglican clergyman shared a ritual space with a Quaker. A wealthy landowner received the same initiation as a craftsman. The gloves were not merely symbolic, they were a statement. Within a decade of the Grand Lodge's founding, Freemasonry had crossed the English Channel and taken root in France. Within 2 decades, it had reached the American colonies, the Caribbean, and the Iberian Peninsula, where, as we have already seen, John Kustos would soon be paying a painful price for his membership. But the spread of Freemasonry was not simply the export of an English institution. What happened when Freemasonry crossed a border was something more complex and more interesting. It adapted. It absorbed the social and cultural conditions of its new environment and was transformed by them. In France, where the social hierarchy was more rigid and the aristocracy more self-consciously exclusive than in England, Freemasonry developed an elaborate system of additional degrees, ranks above the basic 3 of apprentice, fellowcraft, and master that allowed the Brotherhood to replicate French society's obsession with hierarchy within its own walls. By the 1780s, a French Freemason could in theory hold dozens of different degrees, each with its own ritual, its own symbols, and its own claim to deeper access to the ancient wisdom of the craft. The lodge became a kind of parallel social universe, with its own aristocracy. In the American colonies, Freemasonry found a different kind of soil. Here the social hierarchy was less entrenched, the population more mobile, the need for trustworthy networks of mutual support more acute. A man who arrived in a new town knowing no one could walk into a lodge, produce the appropriate signs and grips, and find himself immediately recognized as a brother, which meant he could find lodging, credit, employment, and social connection with a speed that would have been impossible without that institutional bond. This was not conspiracy, it was community. But to those outside the lodge, the distinction was not always clear. By the middle of the 18th century, Freemasonry had developed the institutional structure that would carry it through the next 2.5 centuries. At the base were the individual lodges, each with its own character, its own membership, its own local traditions. Above the lodges were the Grand Lodges, one for each country or region. which established the rules that all the lodges within their jurisdiction were expected to follow. The Grand Lodge issued warrants, official authorizations, to new lodges and could revoke them for violations of Masonic law. The genius of this structure was its combination of uniformity and flexibility. The core rituals, the 3 degrees, the oaths, the symbolic tools, were standardized enough that a Freemason from London could walk into a lodge in Philadelphia or Paris and recognize what was happening. But the details varied. The culture of individual lodges differed enormously. Some were intellectual salons, some were convivial dining clubs, some were political networks, some were genuine communities of moral self-improvement. The Grand Lodge system also created, immediately and inevitably, conflict. Who had the authority to issue warrants? Which lodges were legitimate and which were spurious? When a new degree was invented, and new degrees were being invented constantly, particularly in France, who decided whether it was authentic? These disputes would consume enormous amounts of Masonic energy over the following 2 centuries, generating schisms, rival Grand Lodges, competing ritual systems, and accusations of heresy that would have been comical if the participants had not taken them so desperately seriously. Freemasonry, in other words, was from the beginning a very human institution. Its highest ideals were genuine, and they were sometimes achieved, but they coexisted from the first with vanity, self-interest, snobbery, and the eternal human hunger for status. There is one figure whose role in Freemasonry's early expansion deserves particular attention because his name appears at the very moment when the organization begins its transformation from English social club to global phenomenon. His name is Christopher Wren. Not directly, Wren died in 1723, the year the constitutions were published, and his formal connection to Freemasonry is disputed by historians. But the building that defined his career, St. Paul's Cathedral, completed in 1710, and the network of men who helped him build it, form the immediate social context out of which the premier Grand Lodge of England emerged. The men who gathered in the Goose and Gridiron in 1717 were not anonymous. They included architects and surveyors, scientists and philosophers, men who had worked in the shadow of Wren's great project and absorbed its ambitions. The cathedral itself, rational, geometrically perfect, rising from the ruins of the old city, was a statement about what human reason and craft could achieve. The lodge these men founded carried something of that ambition into its own institutional structure. And then, in 1714, something happened that would prove equally decisive. The Protestant Hanoverian dynasty came to the British throne. The Jacobite threat, the Catholic Stuart claim to the crown, had not disappeared, but it had been checked. England was, for the moment, relatively stable, and in that stability, new institutions could take root. Into that opening stepped the premier Grand Lodge of England. What it offered was not simply fraternity or philosophy or a network of professional contacts. It offered something that the modern world was only beginning to learn how to provide. A way for men of different backgrounds, different beliefs, and different social positions to organize themselves around shared principles rather than shared bloodlines or shared creeds. That idea, the lodge as a model of civil society, would prove to be Freemasonry's most durable and most consequential contribution to the world it helped to build. It would also, in the centuries to come, be the source of its greatest failures, because an institution devoted to the ideal of universal brotherhood, and yet constituted entirely of men, and for most of its history, of white men, of Protestant men, of men with money enough to pay the initiation fees, carried within it a contradiction that no amount of ritual drama could resolve. The square and the compass promised that all men were equal under the eye of the grand architect. The history of the lodge would spend 4 centuries demonstrating exactly how difficult it is to live up to a promise like that. But that history is still unfolding, and before we reach its darkest chapters, we need to spend some time in its most brilliant ones. Because in the decades that follow 1717, the Masonic Lodge becomes something that its founders could not have imagined, the gathering place of the Enlightenment. A salon in a tavern, a place where a Voltaire could receive the acacia branch, where a Mozart could sit in lodge and then go home to write an opera, where the ideas that would eventually detonate the old world order were incubated in candlelit rooms behind closed doors. That story, the story of Freemasonry in the Age of Revolution, is where we are headed next. Chapter 4. Kings, Composers, and Conmen. Freemasonry's Wildest Century. Here is a question that has never quite been answered to anyone's satisfaction. What was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart doing in a Viennese lodge on a cold December evening in 1784, surrounded by men in aprons, watching a blindfolded candidate be led through the darkness toward an altar? Was he there for the philosophy, the brotherhood, the music? Because the lodges of Vienna were famous for their musical evenings, and Mozart himself composed pieces specifically for Masonic ceremonies. Was he there for the social connections in a city where the right acquaintances could make or break a composer's career? Was he there, as some have argued, because the Masonic Brotherhood gave him something that the Catholic Church of his childhood could not? A community that welcomed him as a craftsman and an equal, rather than as an entertainer to be patronized? Or, and this is the possibility that his biographers have circled without ever quite landing on, was he there because Freemasonry in the 18th century was simply where interesting people went? Because that is perhaps the most accurate description of what the lodge became in the decades between 1717 and the French Revolution, the most reliably interesting room in Europe. The place where a minor German composer might find himself sitting next to a French astronomer, a Scottish banker, an Italian diplomat, and a Venetian adventurer, all of them wearing the same white apron, all of them nominally equal, all of them drawn by the same combination of genuine idealism and naked curiosity. The 18th century was Freemasonry's most exhilarating and most chaotic period. It was the century in which the Brotherhood expanded from an English curiosity into a global institution. It was the century in which it attracted some of the finest minds in the Western world. And it was the century in which it generated enough scandal, mysticism, fraud, and sheer human absurdity to keep historians busy for the next 300 years. It deserves to be told at full volume. On the 7th of April, 1778, an old man was helped into a Parisian lodge room with such careful tenderness that the assembled brothers could not be certain he would survive the ceremony. He was 83 years old. His body had been failing for months. His mind, however, that extraordinary, caustic, luminous instrument that had been sharpening itself against the stupidities of church and state for over half a century, remained as precise as ever. His name was François-Marie Arouet. The world knew him as Voltaire. Voltaire had spent his career as the intellectual conscience of the Enlightenment, the writer who used wit and reason as weapons against religious intolerance, judicial brutality, and the comfortable assumption that the existing order of things had been ordained by God. His campaigns on behalf of men wrongly condemned, his devastating satires of ecclesiastical corruption, his philosophical tales that made skepticism feel like a form of joy, these had made him, by the 1770s, the most famous writer in Europe. He had not previously shown any interest in Freemasonry. In fact, he had occasionally mocked it. But in 1778, he returned to Paris after an absence of nearly 3 decades, and Paris, delirious, adoring, a little unhinged with excitement, received him like a returning god. His friends in the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, the Nine Muses, as it was called, one of the most intellectually distinguished lodges in France, decided that this moment demanded a gesture. They simplified the initiation ritual for him in consideration of his age and health. His friend Benjamin Franklin, who happened to be in Paris lobbying for American independence, and who happened also to be a Freemason, was there to support him through the ceremony, literally, as Voltaire could barely stand unassisted. 7 weeks later, Voltaire was dead. He had been a Freemason for less than 2 months. He had attended exactly 1 lodge meeting, and yet the image of Voltaire being initiated, the great rationalist of the age, the scourge of the church, the welcomed into the brotherhood of the square and compass at the very end of his life, became one of the defining symbolic moments of 18th century Freemasonry. It announced something important, that the lodge was not merely a social club or a network of professional contacts. It was, at its best, a community serious enough that the most serious man of the age had judged it worth joining before he died. The lodge that initiated Voltaire was not a typical Parisian lodge, though Paris at this period had no typical lodges, only extraordinary ones. The Nine Sisters had been founded in 1776 by the astronomer Jérôme Lalande, with the explicit purpose of making the lodge a centre of Enlightenment culture, a place where scientists, writers, artists, and philosophers could gather under Masonic principles of brotherhood and mutual respect. It was, in conception, something like a learned society that happened to wear aprons. Its membership reflected these ambitions. The brothers of the Nine Sisters included the inventors of the hot air balloon, the Montgolfier brothers, Joseph Michel and Jacques Etienne, who would demonstrate their invention to an astonished Paris in 1783. They included the physician Joseph Ignace Guillotine, whose name would become permanently attached to the device he proposed as a more humane method of execution, the guillotine. They included painters, poets, naturalists, and musicians of considerable distinction. And they included Benjamin Franklin. Franklin's presence in Paris during these years was a matter of high diplomatic urgency. He had come to persuade the French government to support the American colonies in their war against Britain. He was 50 years old, enormously famous, and extraordinarily skilled at the social navigation required to move between the courts of European power. His Masonic connections gave him an immediate entree into circles that might otherwise have been closed to a colonial printer turned revolutionary diplomat. Franklin eventually became the Venerable Master of the Nine Sisters, the lodge's presiding officer, a position that says something interesting about the intersection of American revolutionary politics and French Freemasonry. In the years leading up to 1789, the lodge was not plotting revolution, but it was, in the most literal sense, providing the social infrastructure within which revolutionary ideas could circulate among people who mattered. While Paris was producing its intellectual lodges, the rest of France was producing something rather different. When Freemasonry arrived in France in the 1720s and 30s, it brought with it the basic structure of the English model: 3 degrees, a grand lodge, a set of guiding principles. Within a decade, French Freemasons had decided that 3 degrees were nowhere near sufficient. The process that followed can only be described as ritual inflation of spectacular proportions. A Scottish nobleman named Andrew Michael Ramsay delivered a speech in Paris in 1736 that became one of the most consequential addresses in Masonic history. Ramsay claimed, with considerable creative freedom, that Freemasonry had not actually been founded by the builders of Solomon's Temple, but by the Crusader knights who rediscovered the temple's secrets during the holy wars of the 12th century. These knights, Ramsay argued, had sworn to rebuild the temple and had preserved their secrets through the centuries in Scotland, which was why the higher degrees of Freemasonry were properly called the Scottish Rite. None of this was historically defensible. Scotland's actual role in Masonic history had been edited out of the official story, and Ramsay was essentially inventing a substitute narrative that served the social needs of French aristocratic culture, specifically its obsession with the glamour of medieval chivalry and knightly honour. But the French lodges loved it. Within 20 years of Ramsay's speech, French Freemasons had created dozens of new degrees built around the imagery of Crusader knights, temple guardians, and ancient mysteries. Within 30 years, there were hundreds. A French historian, looking back at this period, described what had emerged as a tropical rainforest, an explosion of competing ritual systems, each claiming priority and authenticity, each generating its own elaborate ceremonial apparatus. The names alone give some sense of the creative exuberance and occasional derangement involved. Knights of the Round Table, Knights of the Argonauts, Knights of Kadosh, elected philosophers, Scottish Masters of St. Andrew, perfect Masters of the Memphis and Mizraim Rite, Grand Pontiff of the Sublime Jerusalem. These were not merely titles. Each came with its own ritual, its own symbols, its own philosophical framework, and its own initiation ceremony. A sufficiently dedicated French Freemason of the 1780s could in principle hold 60 or 70 different degrees, each conferring a different level of access to a deeper layer of ancient wisdom. The practical consequence of this proliferation was predictable. Lodge meetings in several French cities descended into physical violence as competing factions argued about which degrees were legitimate. In Reims, 2 rival groups fought each other with walking sticks in the street. The governing body of French Freemasonry, the Grand Orient, established in 1773, spent most of its first decade trying to broker peace between factions that regarded the question of ritual authenticity with the intensity usually reserved for theological heresy. Not everyone who came to Freemasonry in the 18th century was looking for philosophy or fellowship. Some were looking for God, or something that felt like God. Jean-Baptiste Willemoes was a silk merchant from Lyon, respectable, charitable, impeccably honest in his business dealings. He was also, beginning in his mid-30s, one of the most obsessive collectors of esoteric knowledge the lodge world had ever produced. By the time he was 40, he had accumulated over 60 different Masonic degrees and had founded his own system, the Black Eagle of St. John, which was dedicated to finding a particular stone that could produce universal happiness and transmute base metals into gold. He was not, in the terms of his time, eccentric. He was representative. Willemoz's intellectual journey took him through the full range of mystical currents flowing through 18th century France. He became a follower of Martinez de Pasquale, a Masonic teacher who claimed that human beings had originally been semi-divine and that the right rituals could restore them to that state. He absorbed the influence of a German movement that traced Freemasonry's origins not to Solomon's Temple or the Crusades, but to the Knights Templar, the military religious order dissolved by a French pope in 1307, whose leaders had been burned at the stake in Paris in 1314. The Templars were, by the 18th century, available for almost any mythological purpose. For the devout Catholic, they were heretics who received their just punishment. For the romantic imagination, they were noble martyrs, destroyed by the greed of a corrupt church. For the Freemason, they were something even more useful. Ancient brothers whose initiation rites and organizational structure uncannily resembled those of the lodge. The conclusion drawn by Willemoz and many others was obvious, if entirely unsupported by evidence. The Templars were Freemasons. The Freemasons were Templars. The secrets of one were the secrets of the other. This was historical fantasy of a high order, but it was productive fantasy. The Templar mythology gave the lodge a narrative of persecution and survival that resonated powerfully with men who were looking for more than a dinner club. It also gave them, in the burning of the last Templar Grand Master Jacques de Molay on the steps of Notre Dame Cathedral, a martyr figure of genuine dramatic power. And then, into this already turbulent world, stepped one of the most extraordinary frauds of the 18th century. Giuseppe Balsamo was born in Palermo, Sicily, in 1743, the son of a small merchant who died young and left his family in modest poverty. By his early 20s, Balsamo had developed a remarkable talent for forgery, petty fraud, and the kind of confident self-presentation that persuades people to believe whatever they most want to believe. He travelled through Europe under various assumed identities, leaving behind a trail of unpaid debts, forged documents, and bewildered former associates. In 1777, following a period of imprisonment in London, he stumbled into a Masonic lodge in Soho and discovered his vocation. He reinvented himself as Count Alessandro di Cagliostro, inventor of the Egyptian rite of Freemasonry, a system of initiation that he claimed descended directly from the mysteries of ancient Egypt, and that promised, among other things, the restoration of youth to the aged. He dressed in scarlet and gold. He travelled with an entourage. He held court in the cities of Europe, London, Paris, Warsaw, St. Petersburg, Strasbourg, offering initiation into his rite and dispensing what he claimed were miraculous cures. For a decade, he was one of the most famous men in Europe. Noble women believed he could rejuvenate them. Princes paid for his company. The French Queen Marie Antoinette, who had never met him, was implicated in a scandal centered on his promises. The Pope eventually had him arrested, tried by the Inquisition, and condemned to life imprisonment. Cagliostro was a charlatan, and not a particularly subtle one. But he was also a symptom of something real, the hunger, in a Europe that was losing faith in its old religious certainties, for something that felt genuinely mysterious, genuinely ancient, genuinely connected to powers beyond the ordinary. Freemasonry, with its rituals and its symbols and its claims of deep historical roots, offered exactly that hunger a menu. Cagliostro simply served the most extravagant items on it. Of all the extraordinary figures who passed through the lodges of 18th century Europe, none generated more confusion, or, arguably, more fascination than the person known as the Chevalier d'Eon. Charles de Beaumont, Chevalier d'Eon, was a French lawyer, soldier, diplomat, spy, and fencer of genuine distinction. He, or she, because the question of d'Eon's gender was never satisfactorily resolved during a lifetime that stretched from 1728 to 1810, served as a French secret agent in Russia, negotiated diplomatic arrangements of considerable delicacy, and then spent nearly 20 years in London in a state of permanent controversy that kept the English betting markets busy and the satirical cartoonists employed. The source of the controversy was simple and endlessly complicated. d'Eon wore women's clothing, privately claimed to be biologically female, publicly denied it, and refused to provide proof either way. In 1768, At the height of the betting frenzy over Deon's biological sex, the Chevalier joined a Masonic lodge on the Strand. The initiation required the candidate to bare part of the chest. Whatever the assembled brothers saw or did not see, Deon was admitted and went on to become a lodge officer. The scandal was immediate and delicious. London's satirical press produced engravings showing Deon being attended simultaneously by embarrassed Freemasons, demanding silence about what they had seen, and by representatives of the betting syndicates demanding proof of what they had not. One image depicted two devils arriving with the papal throne's infamous examination chair, a seat with a hole in it traditionally used to verify the sex of newly elected popes, while a priest stood ready to investigate. But behind the comedy lay something genuinely interesting. When Deon finally declared herself a woman in 1777, the local lodge in her hometown of Tonnerre in Burgundy voted to retain her as a member. Their reasoning was stated with an awkward but genuine warmth. Although she has changed, to exclude her would be to betray our ties of family, blood, and fraternal friendship, as well as the name of our Brotherhood. The Grand Orient refused to recognize this decision. Deon remained a constitutional problem for French Freemasonry, a member who could not, by the rules of the institution, exist, and yet who manifestly did exist, and whose membership the brothers who knew her personally seemed disinclined to revoke. It was, in miniature, a preview of one of Freemasonry's central unresolved tensions: the gap between the Brotherhood's stated ideals, equality, universality, the irrelevance of worldly distinctions within the lodge, and its structural exclusions. If all men were equal in the lodge, what did you do with someone who was not quite a man in the way the rules assumed? The 18th century did not answer this question. In many respects, neither has the 21st. No account of 18th century Freemasonry would be complete without addressing the organization that has generated more conspiracy theories, more internet speculation, and more factual confusion than any other institution in modern history: the Bavarian Illuminati. Here is what the Illuminati actually was. In 1776, a young professor of law at the University of Ingolstadt named Adam Weishaupt gathered 5 of his favorite students and founded a secret society dedicated to ending despotism and superstition. The founding membership was approximately 5 people. Their grand ambition was to establish, across the entire world, a reign of freedom, justice, and reason. Weishaupt disliked Freemasonry. He found its rituals hollow and shallow, but he recognized that the lodge offered exactly the social infrastructure his fledgling organization needed. Beginning in 1780, the Illuminati began infiltrating existing Masonic lodges, recruiting members through the Brotherhood's existing networks. At its peak, the Illuminati had between 600 and 1,000 members. They included princes, government officials, journalists, scholars, and, this being the part that has sustained the mythology, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the greatest German writer of the age. Goethe's membership may have been purely instrumental, a means of monitoring the organization on behalf of the government, but his name on the membership list has proven irresistible to subsequent generations of conspiracy theorists. In 1785, the Bavarian government discovered the Illuminati's existence, raided its members' homes, and scattered the organization. By 1787, it had ceased to function. Its total lifespan was 11 years. Its actual influence on the political events of its era was minimal. And yet, within a decade of its dissolution, the Illuminati had been credited, by the French priest Augustin de Baruel and others, with masterminding the French Revolution, the most convulsive political event in modern European history. Baruel's argument, published in 1797, was not that the Illuminati had directly caused the revolution. It was something more sweeping and more paranoid. That the revolution was the culmination of a vast conspiracy incubated over decades in the lodges of Freemasonry and the cells of the Illuminati, directed by hidden hands toward the destruction of throne and altar. Every horror of the revolution, the executions, the de-Christianization campaign, the terror, had been planned in advance by men meeting in secret behind closed doors. It was a compelling narrative. It was also, as subsequent historians have exhaustively demonstrated, nonsense. French Freemasonry had no unified leadership, no agreed political agenda, and no mechanism for directing collective action. The lodges were full of men with wildly different views about politics, religion, and the proper ordering of society. Many of them were aristocrats and royalists, who would have been horrified by the revolution. Some were executed during it. But Barrel's thesis had a quality that evidence cannot touch. It provided a simple, human cause for an event of incomprehensible complexity. It explained the chaos of history by pointing to a conspiracy. And in doing so, it invented the template for almost every major conspiracy theory of the modern era, including the ones circulating on the internet at this very moment about the Illuminati's continued existence. The Illuminati has been dead for over 2 centuries. It has never been more famous. By 1789, the year the French Revolution began, Freemasonry had been present in France for over 60 years. Its lodges contained lawyers, aristocrats, army officers, philosophers, clergymen, merchants, and musicians. Its membership included men who would become revolutionaries and men who would be executed by revolutionaries. It was, in short, a cross-section of the educated French male population, which means it was a cross-section of everything, and therefore a guide to nothing in particular. The revolution did not come from the lodges. It came from hunger, from financial collapse, from a political system that had run out of ways to manage the contradictions built into it over centuries. The Freemasons who participated in the revolution did so as individuals, following the logic of their own beliefs, their own interests, and their own fears, not as agents of a Masonic plan. But Freemasonry had done something, in those 60 years, that was not nothing. It had created spaces, physical rooms, convivial evenings, ritual communities, in which men of different backgrounds had practiced, in miniature and in symbol, the ideas that the revolution would eventually attempt to enact in the real world: equality before the altar, if not before the law; religious tolerance, if not religious freedom; brotherhood across the boundaries of class, if not the abolition of class itself. The lodge was not the cause of the revolution, but it was, in some sense, one of its rehearsal spaces. And the man who would most powerfully demonstrate what Freemasonry could become, who would transform it from a European intellectual fashion into the civic religion of a new nation, was not a French philosopher or a German mystic, or a Venetian adventurer. He was a Virginia farmer with a surveyor's eye for geometry and a general's instinct for the uses of ceremony. His name was George Washington, and his story is where we go next. Chapter 5, The Republic's High Priest, George Washington and the Masonic America. On the 18th of September, 1793, something happened on a muddy hill above the Potomac River that had never happened before in the history of any nation on earth. The President of the United States put on an apron. Not a work apron, not a kitchen apron. A Masonic apron, white lambskin, trimmed with blue silk, embroidered with the symbols of the Brotherhood. He walked down into a shallow pit where a perfectly cut cornerstone hung suspended from a wooden tripod. He received, in sequence, a silver trowel, a marble gavel, a set of walnut squares, and levels. He spread cement on the stone. He struck it 3 times with the gavel. He poured over it corn, wine, and oil, the ancient Masonic symbols of nourishment, joy, and peace. Then he looked up at the crowd and smiled. The building whose foundation he had just consecrated would become the United States Capitol. The ceremony he had just performed was drawn directly from the ritual traditions of the Masonic Brotherhood. And the man performing it, George Washington, 6 months into his second term as president, was not doing so privately, or reluctantly, or as a concession to the Freemasons who had organized the event. He was doing it deliberately, publicly, with full awareness of what the image communicated. The question that has fascinated historians ever since is why? Why would the leader of a new republic, a nation founded on the explicit separation of church and state, suspicious of hereditary privilege and ancient mystery alike, choose to anchor its most important public ceremonies in the rituals of a secret brotherhood? The answer tells you almost everything you need to know about what America was in those fragile early years and what Freemasonry had become. George Washington was 20 years old, not yet 21, when he walked into a Masonic lodge in Fredericksburg, Virginia, on the 4th of November, 1752, and asked to be initiated. He was ambitious. This is the most important thing to understand about the young Washington. He was the son of a moderately prosperous planter family, but moderately prosperous was not what he intended to remain. He wanted entry into the Virginia gentry, the small, tight-knit circle of great plantation families who controlled the colony's political and economic life. He wanted land, reputation, and the kind of social authority that in Virginia came only to a specific kind of man. Ka. Freemasonry, in the Virginia of the 1750s, was beginning to offer exactly that. The lodges of the colonial South were not yet the great civic institutions they would become, but they were gathering places for men of ambition and connection, and membership carried a social endorsement that a young man on the make could use. Washington was made a Master Mason in August of 1753. He did not become a particularly active lodge member in the years that followed. He attended meetings infrequently, and there is no evidence that he pursued the higher degrees that some of his contemporaries collected with such enthusiasm. But the lodge stayed with him. It gave him a framework for thinking about brotherhood, about voluntary association, about the bonds between men who had chosen to covenant with one another, rather than simply being born into the same family or parish or class. That framework would prove useful in ways the young Washington could not yet imagine. When the Revolutionary War began in 1775, Freemasonry went with it. Military lodges, travelling lodges authorised to initiate new members and conduct ceremonies wherever the regiment happened to be stationed, had existed in the British Army since the early 18th century. As British regiments moved across the globe, they carried the lodge with them. It arrived in North America with the soldiers of the French and Indian War in the 1750s, and it spread from the regular British Army into the colonial militias through exactly the kind of personal contact that military life makes inevitable. By the time the Revolution began, Masonic lodges existed in towns and military units throughout the 13 colonies, and as the Continental Army took shape under Washington's command, the lodge took shape within it. 10 military lodges were established in Washington's army. The largest had several hundred members. Among Washington's generals, 42% were Freemasons. In a force drawn from multiple religious traditions, Anglicans and Quakers, Baptists and Catholics, Dutch Reformed and German Lutherans, the lodge offered something that regimental chaplains could not always provide: a spiritual community that required no specific theological commitment, only a belief in some higher ordering principle and a willingness to stand with your brothers. Washington understood this. He had seen, in the French and Indian War, what happened to men who had no community beyond their immediate fighting unit, who had no framework of shared meaning to make sense of what they were doing and why it mattered. The lodge gave his officers a context. It gave them ceremonies for honouring the fallen, rituals for marking the passage of time, a language of brotherhood that transcended the chaos of the campaign. He attended lodge meetings when circumstances allowed, sitting among his officers not as their commanding general but as a fellow brother, which meant, in the curious egalitarianism of the lodge, as something closer to an equal than the hierarchy of military rank would normally permit. He seems to have genuinely valued this. The letters he wrote to lodges throughout his life carry a warmth that his more formal correspondence rarely achieves. When the British surrendered at Yorktown in 1781 and the new republic began the difficult work of constructing itself from scratch, it faced a problem that no one had quite anticipated. Revolution is, among other things, a ceremony-destroying enterprise. The symbols and rituals that had organised English colonial life, the monarchy's pageantry, the Church of England's calendar, the elaborate deference paid to royal governors and appointed magistrates, were gone. In their place was a republic whose founders were, to put it mildly, uncertain about what a republic's public life should look like. The ancient republics they admired, Athens, Rome, the Italian city-states, had all eventually collapsed into tyranny. The lesson seemed to be that a republic required a very particular kind of citizen, virtuous, self-disciplined, capable of putting the public good above private interest. But how do you create that kind of citizen? How do you build civic culture from nothing? Washington's answer, worked out gradually through the first decade of the Republic, was essentially Masonic. You create ceremonies. You build rituals. You give people symbolic occasions, cornerstone layings, commemorative parades, public dedications that tell them what they belong to and why it matters. You anchor the abstract ideals of the Republic in physical acts and communal experiences that stay in the memory. And you use the brotherhood that is best equipped to perform these ceremonies, the one that already has the rituals, the regalia, the organisational structure, and the nationwide network of men who know how to conduct a solemn public occasion with appropriate gravity. The Freemasons. Between 1789 and 1800, Masonic lodges conducted the cornerstone ceremonies for the United States Capitol, the Massachusetts State House, the Virginia state capitol, the North Carolina State University at Chapel Hill, and dozens of bridges, boundary markers, and public buildings across the young nation. The pattern was consistent: local and visiting Masons in full regalia, the symbols of the craft carried on velvet cushions, the ancient words spoken over the stone, the corn and wine and oil scattered in the ancient Masonic gesture of consecration. Washington presided over the most famous of these ceremonies, but he was not simply performing a personal preference. He was making a statement about what kind of nation America intended to be, one that honoured its own founding myths with the same seriousness that older civilizations had honoured theirs, and one that had found, in the Masonic Brotherhood, a ready-made ceremonial tradition it could adapt to Republican purposes. There is a form of literature that scholars of American Freemasonry have come to call the Washington Correspondence, the hundreds of letters exchanged between the first president and the lodges of the new nation. The lodges wrote to Washington constantly. They congratulated him on his election. They praised his virtue. They claimed him as their most distinguished brother and assured him that the principles of Freemasonry, brotherly love, relief, and truth were the same principles that had made him the man he was. Washington replied to every letter, always warmly, always with some variation of the same theme, that the Masonic Brotherhood's commitment to moral self-improvement was exactly the kind of civic virtue that the Republic depended upon for its survival. These letters were not private correspondence. They were published. They circulated in newspapers throughout the country. They were read aloud in lodge meetings. They performed a specific public function. They established, in print and in ceremony, a symbolic equation between Washington, Freemasonry, and the ideals of the American Republic. It was, in retrospect, a remarkable act of institutional branding. Washington was the most trusted man in America, the one figure whose personal authority transcended faction, region, and ideology. By associating that authority with Freemasonry, he gave the Brotherhood a legitimacy it could not have purchased at any price. And by associating himself with Freemasonry's emphasis on voluntary brotherhood across social boundaries, he gave the Republic a model of civic life that did not depend on aristocracy, established religion, or the bonds of blood. In 1791, writing to a lodge in Charleston, South Carolina, Washington articulated what he understood the connection to mean. Our system of free government is built upon the immutable basis of public virtue. I sincerely hope it will continue to guard the happiness of the architects who constructed it. The architects, the builders in stone, the inheritors of Solomon's temple. The language was deliberate. The Republic was a temple. Freemasonry was its priesthood. Washington died on the 14th of December, 1799, of what his doctors agreed was a throat infection, and what modern medicine would probably diagnose as a combination of acute bacterial epiglottitis and the aggressive bloodletting that his physicians enthusiastically prescribed as treatment. He was 67 years old. He was the most famous man in the Western world, and his funeral was Masonic. Alexandria Lodge No. 22, the lodge that Washington had most closely affiliated himself with in his later years, organized and conducted the burial ceremony at Mount Vernon. The coffin was draped with a Masonic apron and 2 crossed swords. Of the 6 pallbearers drawn from among his former military officers, at least 5 were Freemasons. The officiating Anglican clergyman was a Freemason. At the graveside, the brothers performed the Masonic burial ritual, casting sprigs of evergreen acacia, the symbol of the soul's immortality, onto the coffin as it was lowered. What followed, across the nation, was an extraordinary outpouring of Masonic grief. In Boston, over 1,600 Masons marched through the streets behind a golden urn containing a lock of Washington's hair, while a figure representing the genius of Masonry wept beside it. In Baltimore, the cornerstone ceremony for a Washington monument was conducted by the Maryland Grand Lodge. In Philadelphia, the Grand Lodge organized a memorial procession that newspapers described as one of the largest public gatherings the city had seen. Freemasonry, in these ceremonies, was doing something beyond honoring a dead member. It was claiming him. It was asserting that the man who had built the Republic had been formed, in essential ways, by the Brotherhood, and that the Brotherhood was therefore, in some meaningful sense, the guardian of his legacy and the inheritor of his purposes. It was a bold claim, and for a generation at least, it worked. In the summer of 1826, a man named William Morgan disappeared from the small town of Batavia in upstate New York. He was not a famous man. He was a former bricklayer, a sometime tavern keeper, a man of modest means and poor judgment who had at various points in his life claimed Masonic membership and then fallen out with his local lodge. What made Morgan's disappearance significant, what transformed it from a local mystery into a national catastrophe for American Freemasonry, was what he had been about to do before he vanished. He had been about to publish a book. The book, which appeared anyway after Morgan's disappearance, was called Illustrations of Masonry. It contained, in plain and readable language, the full ritual content of the first 3 Masonic degrees: the oaths, the passwords, the grips, the symbols, the ceremony of Hiram Abif. It was not, in itself, anything that sufficiently determined researchers could not have found in existing publications. But it appeared at exactly the moment when anti-Masonic sentiment in America was beginning to crystallize from vague unease into organized political opposition. Morgan had reportedly been seized from his home in the middle of the night by a group of local Freemasons. He was never seen again. The most likely explanation, supported by considerable circumstantial evidence, though never proven beyond doubt in a court of law, was that he had been murdered. The political consequences were immediate and severe. In the elections that followed, an anti-Masonic party emerged, the first genuine third party in American political history. Its core argument was simple and, in the overheated atmosphere of the 1820s, devastatingly effective. Freemasonry was a secret government operating within the Republic. Its members protected each other from the law. Its lodges served as parallel power structures that undermined democratic accountability. The Masons who had seized Morgan had acted, not as individuals, but as agents of an organization that placed its own loyalties above those of the nation. The lodges of New York State, which had numbered nearly 500 in 1825, shrank to fewer than 50 within a decade. Grand lodges across the country lost members by the tens of thousands. The Brotherhood that Washington had built into the civic religion of the Republic was, within a single generation of his death, being treated as the Republic's most dangerous enemy. The anti-Masonic movement eventually faded, absorbed into the larger currents of American politics. But the Morgan affair left a permanent mark on the way Freemasonry understood itself and the way outsiders understood it. What the affair revealed, brutally, unavoidably, was the gap that had always existed between Freemasonry's ideals and its human reality. The Brotherhood preached that it stood for equality before the law, yet Masonic judges had helped Masonic defendants escape justice. It preached that it welcomed men of all backgrounds into equal fellowship, yet its lodges in the South were refusing membership to African Americans while accepting slaveholders without apparent moral difficulty. It preached that it was not a political organization, yet its members clearly used their Masonic connections to advance political careers, obtain favorable verdicts, and conduct business in ways that excluded outsiders. None of this made Freemasonry uniquely corrupt. Every human institution that claims high ideals falls short of them in practice. The Catholic Church preaches poverty and has accumulated extraordinary wealth. Political parties dedicated to liberty have repeatedly suppressed it in power. Professional associations devoted to excellence have routinely protected mediocrity. What made Freemasonry's failure particularly visible was the extravagance of its claims. An institution that wrapped itself in the symbolism of Solomon's Temple and the moral authority of George Washington had set a very high standard for itself. The Morgan affair showed that the men inside the lodge were, in the end, men with all the ordinary human capacity for cowardice, self-interest, and group loyalty that trumps principle when the pressure is on. The lesson the Republic should have drawn from the Morgan affair was the lesson it has repeatedly needed to relearn throughout its history, that no institution, however noble its founding ideals, is immune to the corrupting influence of unchecked power and the gravitational pull of in-group loyalty. Instead, America drew a somewhat simpler lesson. It decided that Freemasonry was dangerous. Then, within a generation, it forgot why. And then it joined in enormous numbers and built the most elaborate Masonic civilization the world had ever seen. By the 1850s, the anti-Masonic movement had dissolved. The lodges were growing again. By the eve of the Civil War, American Freemasonry was larger than it had ever been, and more deeply embedded in the fabric of national life. 14 American presidents would eventually be Freemasons, from Washington through Gerald Ford, with Truman as the most devout, having served as Grand Master of Missouri before reaching the White House. The Capitol building that Washington had consecrated with his apron and trowel stood surrounded by Masonic symbolism in its architecture, its orientation, its founding mythology. The eye above the pyramid on the dollar bill, widely believed to be a Masonic symbol, gazed out from the currency of everyday commerce. But beneath this triumphant surface, a deeper story was unfolding, one that the grand Masonic lodges with their marble floors and ceremonial regalia were not equipped to see. Because while white American Freemasons were laying cornerstones and toasting their dead presidents, another brotherhood was being built in the shadows of their exclusion. A brotherhood that took the Masonic ideals of equality and fraternal solidarity with a seriousness that the White Lodges had long since abandoned. Its name was Prince Hall Freemasonry, and its story is the one that, in many ways, matters most. Chapter 6. The Other Brotherhood, Prince Hall, Black America, and the Masonic Promise Unfulfilled. There is a story American Freemasonry has never quite known how to tell about itself. It is not the story of George Washington laying the Capitol cornerstone in his apron. It is not the story of 14 presidents and their lodge memberships, or the all-seeing eye on the dollar bill, or the grand marble temples that still stand in the hearts of American cities. It is not the story that gets displayed in gleaming bronze and polished oak in the Masonic Brotherhood Center pavilions of World's Fairs. It is the story of a man named Prince Hall, who in 1775 walked up to a British Army lodge in Boston, the very city where the Revolution was beginning, and asked to be initiated. He was a free black man in a colony where most men who looked like him were enslaved. He was told yes, and then, for the next 2 centuries, almost everything that followed was a lesson in the distance between what Freemasonry promised and what it was actually willing to deliver. Prince Hall's origins are disputed in almost every detail. He was born sometime around 1735, probably in Barbados, possibly in Africa, conceivably in New England. By the 1760s, he had established himself in Boston as a leather worker, a craftsman, like the stonemasons whose trade had given Freemasonry its name, and had become a figure of some standing in Boston's small free black community. On the 3rd of March, 1775, Hall and 14 other free black men were initiated into Lodge number 441, a military lodge attached to a British Army regiment, then stationed near Boston. The timing is worth pausing over. This was 6 weeks before the battles of Lexington and Concord, the revolution that would produce a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal had not yet officially begun. And yet here was a British military lodge initiating 15 free black men into the Brotherhood of the Square and Compass. The initiation was genuine, the Masonic warrant was real, the oaths were the same oaths taken by every other Freemason on earth. What was not real? What would prove to be the great fiction that American Freemasonry would spend over 2 centuries sustaining was the idea that this initiation made Prince Hall and his brothers equal members of the American Masonic community. When the British troops departed Boston after the Revolution, Hall applied to the white American Grand Lodges for recognition. He was refused. The grounds given were technical. His warrant had been issued by a British military lodge, not a civilian one, and there were procedural irregularities. But the technical objections were a polite way of saying something that the White Lodges were not yet prepared to state directly. In 1784, Hall applied directly to the Grand Lodge of England, the mother lodge of global Freemasonry, and received a proper warrant. African Lodge number 459 was formally constituted. It was a legitimate Masonic lodge, by every measure, the craft acknowledged. The white American Grand Lodges continued to refuse recognition. In 1797, Hall addressed his lodge in Boston with words that cut to the heart of the contradiction. "Patience, I say," he told his brothers, "for were we not possessed of a great measure of it, we could not bear up under the daily insults we meet with in the streets of Boston." He was talking about the streets, but he was also talking about the lodge. The refusal of white American Freemasonry to recognize Prince Hall and his successors was not, initially, based on a coherent argument. It was based on a feeling, the feeling that the racial hierarchy of American society should be reflected within the lodge walls, regardless of what the ritual said about the irrelevance of worldly distinctions. Over time, the white Grand Lodges developed more elaborate justifications. In the 19th century, a prominent Masonic scholar named Albert Mackey argued that Prince Hall Freemasonry was clandestine, meaning it operated outside proper Masonic authority. This was, as subsequent historians demonstrated thoroughly and repeatedly, simply false. The Grand Lodge of England warrant was unambiguous. But false arguments, stated with sufficient authority by sufficiently credentialed people, can function as truth within an institution for a remarkably long time. The deeper truth was simpler and more brutal. American Freemasonry, for most of its history, was a white institution that had decided to remain a white institution. The Masonic principles of universal brotherhood, the idea that the apron erased the distinctions of class and creed, that all men were equal at the altar of the Grand Architect, were understood to apply within a specific racial boundary. The boundary was not stated, it did not need to be. It was enforced by refusal, by exclusion, by the simple mechanism of never meeting someone's eyes when they knocked at the door. Prince Hall Freemasonry did not wait for permission. In 1797, following Hall's original lodge, a second Prince Hall Lodge was established in Philadelphia. In 1817, the African Grand Lodge, which would eventually rename itself the Prince Hall Grand Lodge, declared itself independent of the English Grand Lodge and began issuing its own warrants. By the middle of the 19th century, Prince Hall Masonic lodges existed in every northern state and in many southern ones, forming a network of community institutions that served needs the white lodges had never been asked to address. Because the needs were different, profoundly, urgently different. White American Freemasons joined the lodge for fellowship, for civic engagement, for the pleasure of ceremony, and the warmth of brotherhood. These were genuine benefits, and they were real, but they were the benefits of men who already had a society, who had access to courts and contracts and credit and the full protection of the law. Black Americans, in the 19th century, had none of these things. They lived in a society that was, by design, organized to exclude them from its basic protections. White-owned insurance companies refused to write policies for black customers. White-owned banks refused to extend credit. White cemeteries refused burial to black bodies. White courts delivered verdicts shaped by assumptions so deeply embedded they were invisible to the men who held them. Into this landscape, Prince Hall Freemasonry inserted itself as something the white lodges had never needed to be, a comprehensive parallel institution. The lodge provided life insurance through collective pooling of resources. It organized credit through informal lending among members. It purchased land for black cemeteries. It created schools when public schools were segregated or non-existent. It built the social infrastructure of black middle-class life from materials that the dominant society had refused to provide. And it did something else, something that, in retrospect, may have been its most consequential contribution. It trained leaders. The connection between Prince Hall Freemasonry and the abolition movement runs through the 19th century like a river beneath a city, mostly invisible from the surface, but shaping everything above it. Prince Hall himself had petitioned the Massachusetts legislature for the abolition of slavery as early as 1777. The petition failed, but the impulse it represented never left the lodges he had founded. Throughout the antebellum period, Prince Hall lodges were gathering places for free black men who were also, in many cases, active participants in the underground networks that moved enslaved people northward to freedom. Martin Delany, physician, writer, explorer, officer, the man sometimes called the father of black nationalism, was a Prince Hall Freemason. Frederick Douglass, the greatest orator of the abolition movement, moved in circles thoroughly entangled with Prince Hall Masonry, though his own formal membership has been disputed. The lodges provided not just community but a particular kind of community, one organized around ceremony, around the keeping of oaths, around the principle that a man's worth was measured by his character rather than his complexion. These were Masonic ideals, but in Prince Hall lodges, unlike in white Masonic lodges, they were applied without exception. When the Civil War finally arrived, this tradition bore its most dramatic fruit in the story of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, the regiment whose assault on Fort Wagner in July of 1863 became one of the defining moments of the war, of American history. The 54th was the first regiment of free black men organized in the North for service in the Union Army. Its recruitment was largely organized by Prince Hall Freemasons. Many of its enlisted men were lodge members. Its colonel, Robert Gould Shaw, was a white man from a Boston abolitionist family, but the network that filled his ranks was black, Masonic, and deeply organized. The assault on Fort Wagner cost the 54th enormous casualties. Shaw was killed. The regiment's flag bearer, Sergeant William Carney, was shot multiple times but carried the colours across the field without allowing them to touch the ground. The battle was a military failure and a moral triumph, proof, argued across the North, that black men could and would fight and die for a nation that had not yet decided whether they were citizens. The Prince Hall lodges understood what had happened at Fort Wagner in Masonic terms. Their brothers had demonstrated, under fire, the virtues that the lodge had always claimed to cultivate: courage, loyalty, steadfastness, under pressure. The Brotherhood had produced men capable of exactly this. After the Civil War, the brief, extraordinary period of Reconstruction offered a glimpse of what American Freemasonry might have become if its principles had been taken seriously. Black men voted. Black men held office. Black Reconstruction governments built public schools, reformed tax systems, and established institutions that served all citizens, regardless of race. In this political environment, Prince Hall Freemasonry flourished. New lodges were established throughout the South. Membership grew rapidly. The network of black civic institutions, lodges, churches, schools, mutual aid societies expanded to fill the space that Reconstruction had temporarily opened. And then Reconstruction ended. The federal troops withdrew. The white supremacist governments returned. The legal gains of Reconstruction were systematically dismantled through violence, fraud, and the quiet cooperation of federal authorities who had decided that the experiment was over. The black men who had voted and held office and built institutions found themselves, within a generation, stripped of the franchise, subjected to terror, and living under a system of legal apartheid that would persist for nearly a century. Within the Masonic world, this larger catastrophe was replicated in miniature. White Masonic lodges in the South not only refused to recognize Prince Hall lodges, they actively worked to suppress them. In some states, Prince Hall lodges were forced to meet in secret, their activities hidden from white authorities who might use any pretext to disrupt them. The white American Masonic establishment, meanwhile, maintained the fiction that its refusal to recognize Prince Hall Freemasonry was a matter of technical Masonic law rather than racial prejudice. This fiction was believed by fewer and fewer people, but it was maintained with remarkable persistence. By the middle of the 20th century, Prince Hall Freemasonry had developed into something that its founders could not have entirely anticipated. One of the most important institutional foundations of the civil rights movement. The connection was not incidental. It was structural. Thurgood Marshall was a Prince Hall Freemason, the lawyer who argued Brown v. Board of Education before the Supreme Court in 1954. The case that struck down the legal framework of school segregation received crucial financial support from Prince Hall lodges. In 1958, Marshall publicly thanked his Masonic brothers, stating that without their support, several landmark civil rights cases would not have reached the Supreme Court at all. When he was appointed to the Supreme Court in 1967, becoming the first African American to serve as a justice, the Prince Hall lodges celebrated him as their own. Rosa Parks was not herself a lodge member. Freemasonry remained formally restricted to men, but her grandfather and her father were both Prince Hall Freemasons, and she was an active member of the Order of the Eastern Star, the Prince Hall-affiliated organization that admitted the female relatives of Masons and, in the Black Masonic tradition, gave those women genuine organizational authority rather than merely ceremonial participation. The Eastern Star had a long history of cultivating exactly the kind of quiet, disciplined, organizationally sophisticated leadership that Parks embodied in her refusal on a Montgomery bus in December of 1955 to give up her seat. The NAACP's Washington office was housed, for decades, in the Prince Hall Grand Lodge building on U Street in the heart of Black Washington. The overlap between the two organizations, in membership, in leadership, in organizational culture, was so complete that it was sometimes difficult to say where one ended and the other began. Medgar Evers, the NAACP field secretary in Mississippi who was shot dead in his driveway in June of 1963, was a Prince Hall Freemason. His office was located inside the Prince Hall Lodge Hall on Lynch Street in Jackson. When his body lay in state before his funeral, 5,000 people stood in 39-degree heat in a line, 2 miles long to pay their respects. Many of them Masonic brothers who understood that one of their own had been murdered for doing what the lodge had always said it stood for. The man who murdered him, Byron de la Beckwith, was also a Freemason, a white Freemason. a member of a lodge that had spent generations refusing to acknowledge that Evers and his brothers had any claim on the Brotherhood at all. Two Masons, two lodges, two completely different understandings of what the apron meant. The question of mutual recognition, whether white and black American Masonic lodges would formally acknowledge each other as legitimate expressions of the same brotherhood, dragged on for over 2 centuries with a slowness that said everything about the depth of American racial division. The first breakthrough came in 1989 in Connecticut, over 200 years after Prince Hall received his initiation. Connecticut's White Grand Lodge became the first in the country to formally recognize its Prince Hall counterpart as legitimate. The process that followed was agonizingly gradual. State by state, White Grand Lodges made the decision, or refused to make it. By 2006, 11 states still withheld recognition. Those 11 states were, without exception, states that had formed the Confederacy. As of 2019, 7 White Grand Lodges in the United States still refused to recognize Prince Hall Freemasonry. 7 lodges in 7 states, maintaining a position that their own ritual contradicted, their own history indicted, and their own stated principles condemned, maintaining it because some truths are harder to act on than to speak. An elderly Prince Hall official named Alton Roundtree, who had spent his life documenting the history of his lodge and fighting for its recognition, put it with the patience of a man who had learned to measure progress in decades rather than years. The situation is a disgrace. The former slave states are slow to recognize Prince Hall. I grew up in segregation. As older white Masons from the former slave states die, change has come. Brothers who grew up after the Civil Rights Act are more inclined to recognize Prince Hall. It is still a struggle. Still a struggle. In a brotherhood that has been telling itself for 3 centuries that it stands for the equality of all men before the grand architect of the universe. And yet Prince Hall Freemasonry, for all the injustice visited upon it, built something real. Something that the White Lodges, with all their marble and their presidential portraits and their famous names, never quite managed to build in the same way. It built a community. Not a community of the powerful, seeking to refine their power. A community of the excluded, seeking to survive and eventually to transform the society that had excluded them. A community that took the Masonic principles of brotherhood, charity, and moral self-improvement, and applied them without the asterisk that white American Freemasonry had always maintained. The unspoken footnote that said these principles applied to men who looked a certain way and came from a certain background. Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall, Medgar Evers, Nat King Cole, Duke Ellington, Sugar Ray Robinson. These were Prince Hall men. They were shaped in part by a tradition that told them, in ceremony and in symbol, in the oath at the altar and the grip of the handshake, that they were brothers in something serious, something worth belonging to, something that demanded the best of them. The White Lodges that refused to recognize them were not simply being racist, though they were certainly being that. They were also being foolish, because the brotherhood they were excluding was, in many respects, a more faithful expression of Masonic ideals than the one they were maintaining. The lost word of Freemasonry, the true master's secret, the knowledge that died with Hiram Abif and was never recovered, is in the ritual, a symbol of incompleteness, of the gap between aspiration and achievement. 2 centuries of Prince Hall Freemasonry suggest another interpretation. Perhaps the lost word was always equality, and perhaps the men who came closest to finding it were the ones who were told, at every door, that the lodge was not for them. Chapter 7. The Dictator's Nightmare. Fascism, the Nazis, and the lodge that turned dark. Here is something that the conspiracy theorists have always gotten exactly backwards. They will tell you that Freemasonry controls governments, that the Brotherhood operates from the shadows, pulling the strings of presidents and prime ministers, bending the machinery of state to its hidden purposes. They will show you the eye on the dollar bill, the Masonic symbolism in the street plan of Washington, the lodge memberships of heads of state. They will construct elaborate diagrams connecting the lodges to every major event of the modern world. What they will not tell you, what fundamentally breaks their argument, is this. Every genuinely authoritarian government of the 20th century considered Freemasonry one of its most dangerous enemies. Not an ally, not a tool, an enemy. Mussolini banned it. Hitler exterminated its members. Franco spent decades hunting it down with the obsessive fury of a man who believed it was personally responsible for everything he hated about the modern world. Stalin suppressed it wherever Soviet power reached. The Islamic Republic of Iran banned it, the regimes of Eastern Europe banned it, the military dictatorships of Latin America banned it. If Freemasonry truly controlled governments, it was remarkably bad at protecting itself from the governments it supposedly controlled. The real story is both more interesting and more disturbing than the conspiracy theorists imagine, because the relationship between Freemasonry and 20th century authoritarianism is not a story of hidden power. It is a story of what happens when a brotherhood built on the ideals of tolerance, reason, and voluntary association encounters regimes that have decided those ideals are the enemy. And it is, in one particularly dark chapter, a story of what happens when Freemasonry's own structural weaknesses, its tolerance for secrecy, its protection of members, its tradition of mutual loyalty, are turned against the values the Brotherhood was supposed to represent. The first major fascist assault on Freemasonry came not from Hitler's Germany, but from Mussolini's Italy, and it came earlier than most people realize. When Benito Mussolini seized power in Italy in 1922, Freemasonry was deeply embedded in Italian civic life. The Brotherhood had played a significant role in the Risorgimento, the 19th century movement for Italian unification, and many of its most celebrated heroes, including Giuseppe Garibaldi, had been prominent Freemasons. In the decades since unification, Italian lodges had served as gathering places for liberal politicians, professional men, and intellectuals committed to the values of secular democracy. This was precisely why Mussolini hated them. The fascist movement did not object to secret societies as such. Mussolini's black shirts were themselves a kind of fraternal organization, with their own rituals, their own hierarchy, their own cult of masculine solidarity. What Mussolini objected to was a secret society whose loyalties ran to something other than the fascist state, a brotherhood whose members might feel bound to one another and to principles of liberal democracy in ways that competed with their obligation to the deuce. In 1925, following the consolidation of his dictatorship, Mussolini ordered all fascist party members to resign from Freemasonry. The following year, he banned the Brotherhood outright. Lodge meetings became illegal. Masonic property was seized. Members were publicly identified, stripped of their positions, and subjected to systematic harassment. The fascist press produced a literature of anti-Masonic propaganda that drew on every available conspiracy theory and invented several new ones. Freemasons were simultaneously portrayed as Jewish plotters, as agents of international capitalism, as servants of British imperialism, and as the hidden directors of Italian communism, a combination of accusations so contradictory that it was impossible to take seriously as political analysis, but remarkably effective as a mobilizing myth for people who needed someone to blame for the dislocations of the modern world. The Italian lodge that responded most directly to fascist pressure was the Grande Oriente d'Italia, the main Italian Grand Lodge. Its Grand Master, Domizio Torrigiani, was arrested, sent into internal exile, and eventually died in a labour camp. Hundreds of his brothers were beaten, imprisoned, or forced to flee the country. The lodges were closed, their archives were seized and used to compile lists of members who could be targeted for further persecution. In the Masonic archive of the conquered lodges, the fascist government found something it had not expected. Evidence not of a vast anti-fascist conspiracy, but of something far more mundane. The minutes of lodge meetings, the correspondence between brothers, the records of charitable activities, and philosophical discussions. The ordinary administrative paperwork of civic institutions that had never been anything more dangerous than what they claimed to be. None of this affected the fascist narrative. Evidence of innocence was not the point. The accusation was the point. The Nazi assault on Freemasonry was both more thorough and more explicitly murderous than the Italian version, and it drew on a specific strand of German anti-Masonic mythology that had been developing since the late 19th century. In the elaborate racial cosmology of Nazi ideology, Freemasonry occupied a peculiar position. The Brotherhood was understood as simultaneously a Jewish instrument, a mechanism by which Jewish financiers and intellectuals maintained control over European society, and an independent threat in its own right, representing the Enlightenment values of universal brotherhood and human equality that National Socialism was committed to destroying. The contradiction did not trouble the Nazi theorists. Anti-Masonic ideology had always been comfortable with contradictions. The lodge was whatever its enemies needed it to be. When Hitler came to power in January of 1933, German Freemasonry was already in a weakened state. The Brotherhood had endured years of nationalist pressure and public hostility. Some German Grand Lodges had, in a desperate attempt to demonstrate their patriotic credentials, expelled their Jewish members and adopted an explicitly nationalist rhetoric. This capitulation purchased them nothing. By June of 1933, all Masonic lodges in Germany had been dissolved or forced to dissolve themselves. German Freemasons who could prove Aryan ancestry and who had resigned from the Brotherhood before a certain date were generally permitted to continue their lives unmolested, though they remained under surveillance and suspicion. Those who had been active in the lodge, who held senior positions, or who could not or would not demonstrate sufficient distance from their Masonic past faced arrest, imprisonment in concentration camps, and in many cases death. The precise number of Freemasons who were killed by the Nazi regime is difficult to establish. The records are incomplete, and many victims were counted under other categories, as Jews, as political prisoners, as resistors. Estimates range from 80,000 to 200,000 deaths across Nazi-occupied Europe, though some historians argue the figure was considerably lower. What is not disputed is that Masonic membership was sufficient grounds in the Nazi system for arrest, deportation, and murder. In the concentration camps, Freemasons were required to wear a specific identifying symbol, an inverted red triangle. It placed them in the same category as political prisoners, distinct from the yellow star worn by Jews, the pink triangle worn by gay men, the purple triangle worn by Jehovah's Witnesses. The triangle was both a bureaucratic classification and a public statement. These men had been identified as enemies of the state, sorted and marked, their fate administered with the same systematic efficiency that the regime applied to every category of its victims. Of all the 20th century dictators who persecuted Freemasonry, none did so with the personal intensity of Franco. Franco's hostility to the Brotherhood was not primarily ideological, in the sense of being derived from a coherent theory of Masonic conspiracy. It was something closer to phobia, an irrational, totalizing conviction that Freemasonry was the source of everything wrong with Spain and with the modern world. He returned to the subject throughout his career with a fixation that his own supporters sometimes found embarrassing. In his speeches and writings, Franco attributed an extraordinary range of historical catastrophes to Masonic influence: the loss of Spain's American colonies, the decline of the Spanish monarchy, the secularization of Spanish society, the rise of the Spanish Republic, the Civil War itself, and virtually every political disappointment of his long dictatorship. The Freemasons were, in Franco's worldview, the hidden force behind every misfortune, international, coordinated, implacable, and specifically hostile to Catholic Spain. The reality of Spanish Freemasonry, as historians have documented in exhaustive detail, was rather more modest. The Brotherhood had perhaps 10,000 members in Spain at the time of the Civil War, a tiny fraction of the population, concentrated mainly in urban professional classes and the liberal political parties of the Republic. It had no unified political agenda, no coordinated plan, and no mechanism for the kind of conspiratorial coordination that Franco attributed to it. None of this reduced the ferocity of the Francoist persecution. After the nationalist victory in the Civil War, Freemasonry was banned by law. The anti-Masonic tribunal, established by Franco's government, prosecuted thousands of men for the crime of past lodge membership that, in many cases, predated the Civil War by decades. The penalties range from dismissal from public employment to imprisonment to execution. In Salamanca, the nationalist authorities established a special anti-Masonic archive, the product of captured lodge records from across Spain, that became the bureaucratic foundation of the persecution. The archive documented individual lodge memberships, degrees attained, and lodge activities with the thoroughness of men who believed they were mapping an enemy intelligence network. Franco personally reviewed many of its files. The most disturbing exhibit in the story of Francoist anti-Masonry is a lodge that does not exist. In Salamanca, the regime constructed a fake Masonic lodge, a physical reproduction of a lodge room, complete with the black and white checkered floor, the altar, the columns, the symbolic furniture of the craft. It was designed as a museum exhibit, open to the public, intended to demonstrate the sinister reality of Masonic ritual to visitors who had never seen the inside of a real lodge. It is still there. It still receives visitors. The lodge that Franco built to display Freemasonry's evil has outlasted every real lodge in Salamanca by decades. And now, the chapter that the Masonic Brotherhood has never been able to explain away. Because everything we have discussed so far involves Freemasonry as victim. The Brotherhood persecuted by authoritarians who feared its liberal principles, hunted down by states that regarded its values as dangerous. This narrative is true. The persecution was real. The victims were real. The Freemasons of Nazi-occupied Europe, who were sent to concentration camps for the crime of wearing an apron, are as genuine a category of victims as the history of the 20th century contains. But there is another story. A story in which the lodge does not appear as a victim of power, but as an instrument of it. A story in which the secrecy and mutual loyalty that protected Masonic brothers from persecution became the mechanisms of corruption and conspiracy. The story of Propaganda Due, Lodge P2. Propaganda Due was a lodge of the Grande Oriente d'Italia that had been established in the early 20th century as a lodge for senior figures who required unusual discretion, politicians, military officers, and public servants who could not, for various reasons, be publicly identified as Freemasons. The principle of confidential membership was not, in itself, scandalous. There were legitimate reasons why a senior judge or a senior civil servant might prefer that his lodge membership not be a matter of public record. The scandal was what happened to this principle of discretion when it fell into the wrong hands. In the early 1960s, a man named Lizio Gelli joined the lodge and began, with extraordinary patience and skill, the process of transforming it into something the founders of Freemasonry could not have imagined. Gelli was a small, spectacled man who manufactured mattresses in the Tuscan town of Arezzo, and who seemed, on the surface, to be nothing more than a moderately successful provincial businessman. Beneath the surface, he was one of the most accomplished manipulators of the post-war Italian political world, a man who had collaborated with the fascists, reinvented himself after the war, and developed an instinct for the leverage that information provides when applied to the right people in the right way. As the venerable master of P2, Gelli used the lodge's tradition of confidential membership to assemble a list of members whose identities he carefully documented and whose secrets he systematically collected. The list, when it was finally seized by Italian authorities in 1981, contained nearly 1,000 names. They included cabinet ministers and former prime ministers, military chiefs of staff, the heads of all 3 Italian intelligence services, senior judges and prosecutors, newspaper editors and television executives, bankers and industrialists. This was not a Masonic lodge. It was a shadow government, organized on Masonic principles of secrecy and mutual obligation, directed by a single man who understood that knowledge of a person's secrets is the most durable form of power there is. Gelli called his vision the Piano di Rinascita Democratica, the plan for democratic rebirth. Its actual content was not democratic renewal. It was a blueprint for controlling Italian society from within, for placing P2 members in key positions across every major institution, and then using those positions to advance the interests of the lodge and its venerable master. The full scope of P2's activities has never been definitively established. What is known includes the following. P2 members were implicated in the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano, the largest bank failure in Italian history to that point, which also involved the Vatican Bank and resulted in the death of its director, Roberto Calvi, who was found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London in 1982. Whether Calvi was murdered or took his own life has never been definitively determined. But the involvement of P2 members in the affairs of the bank was not in question. P2. Members were implicated in a bombing at Bologna train station in August of 1980, the most lethal terrorist attack in post-war Italian history, which killed 85 people. Gelli himself was later convicted of obstruction of justice in connection with the investigation, accused of helping to obscure the identities of those responsible. P. 2 members included figures associated with Italy's years of lead, the period of political violence in the 1970s, when far-right and far-left terrorism claimed hundreds of lives, and when the boundary between terrorism, state complicity and organised crime became difficult to locate. When the P2 list was discovered, hidden inside a suitcase in the false bottom of a wardrobe in Gelli's Arezzo villa, it produced a political crisis of the first order. Governments fell. Investigations were launched. Several members of the list resigned their positions. Gelli himself fled to South America, was extradited, tried, convicted on multiple charges, and eventually released under house arrest in his 90s. 2089. The Italian Parliament, having reviewed the evidence, concluded that P2 had functioned as an illegal secret association with the aim of subverting the constitutional order of the Italian Republic. The lesson of P2 is not that Freemasonry is inherently corrupt. It is something both more specific and more unsettling. The features that make the Masonic Lodge a genuine community, the secrecy, the oath, the mutual obligation, the tradition of protecting brothers, the network of trust that operates outside normal institutional channels, are exactly the features that make the Lodge a potentially useful vehicle for the kind of corruption that P2 represented. The Lodge did not create Licio Gelli. He would have found some other vehicle for his ambitions if Freemasonry had not been available. But the Masonic Lodge provided him with the specific infrastructure he needed, a tradition of confidential membership, a culture of mutual loyalty that discouraged scrutiny of one another's activities, and a network that included exactly the kind of men, in exactly the right positions, whose cooperation he required. This is the version of Freemasonry that its admirers have always struggled to acknowledge, and its enemies have always exaggerated. The Lodge is not a conspiracy, but it has, at certain moments in its history, provided the conditions under which conspiracy becomes possible. The Hiram Abif myth tells the story of a man killed for refusing to reveal the secrets of the Lodge. P2 is the story of a man who used the secrets of the Lodge to make himself untouchable. Both stories are true. Both stories are Masonic. In the concentration camps of Nazi-occupied Europe, Freemasons wearing their inverted red triangles found, sometimes, that the Lodge gave them a last fragment of community in the worst conditions imaginable. Brothers recognized each other through the signs and grips they had learnt at initiation, signs and grips that had been designed centuries earlier to allow travelling stonemasons to identify one another in foreign cities. In the camps they served the same function, a grip exchanged in a line, a sign given across a yard. Elect 12, the recognition that another man here had taken the same oath, shared the same ritual experience, belonged to the same brotherhood. In the context of the camps, this was not nothing. It was, in some cases, the difference between complete isolation and something that felt, however faintly, like belonging. After the war, the lodges of Germany, Austria, Italy, France, and the occupied countries rebuilt themselves from almost nothing. In some places, the rebuilding was quick. In others, it took decades. In the countries behind the Iron Curtain, it did not happen at all until the wall came down. But the memory of what had happened, the knowledge that tens of thousands of men had been killed, in part because they wore an apron, changed Freemasonry in ways that are still being worked out. The Brotherhood that had been persecuted for its liberal principles came out of the 20th century with those principles more clearly articulated than ever before. The lodges of the post-war world were more explicitly committed to democracy, to human rights, to the separation of church and state than the lodges of any previous era. And they carried, alongside this clarity, the uncomfortable knowledge that the same institution had produced Licio Gelli. The square and the compass, held together, create a tension. The square enforces right angles, precision, honesty, the demand that things be what they claim to be. The compass draws circles, community, inclusion, the bond between brothers. In its best moments, Freemasonry holds these in balance. In its worst, one overwhelms the other. The history of the 20th century showed both possibilities in full and unambiguous colour. Chapter 8. The Secret is Dead. Long live the Brotherhood. Freemasonry's decline and its unfinished story. There is a photograph taken in 1956 that tells you almost everything you need to know about American Freemasonry at the height of its power. It was taken for Life magazine, the most widely read publication in the country, the visual record of what American life looked like at its most confident and self-assured. The photograph shows a group of Brooklyn Freemasons in full ceremonial regalia, reenacting the dedication of Solomon's Temple. The setting is elaborate. The costumes are elaborate. The solemnity of the occasion is carefully maintained. The men in the photograph are middle-aged, well-fed, comfortable. They are performing one of the oldest rituals in the Western world, in a lodge hall in Brooklyn, for a magazine photographer, for an audience of millions of Americans who are curious about what goes on inside the lodge. There is something quietly extraordinary about this image. These men are performing a secret ritual for a mass-market magazine, and nobody, not the magazine, not the men, not the millions of readers, seems to find this particularly contradictory. That is the moment Freemasonry had reached by the mid-20th century in America. 410,000 members in 1959, the all-time peak, lodges in every city and town. A Masonic brother in the White House, Harry Truman, who wore his Grand Master's regalia with the unself-conscious pride of a man who considered it the most important title he had ever held. A Masonic hand laying cornerstones on public buildings from coast to coast, Masonic symbolism on the national currency, in the architecture of the Capitol, in the rhetoric of civic life. The secret had become a public institution, and the public institution was about to start dying. The decline of American Freemasonry is one of the most dramatic institutional collapses of the post-war era, and it happened so gradually that most people outside the lodge, and many inside it, did not notice it until the fall was well advanced. In 1959, there were 4,100,000 Freemasons in the United States. By 1984, fewer than 3 million. By 1998, fewer than 2 million. By 2017, the last year for which reliable figures are available, slightly over 1 million. In less than 60 years, American Freemasonry lost roughly 3/4 of its membership. The decline followed a consistent, unbroken trajectory, with no significant reversals. It was not the product of a scandal, or a single cause, or a moment of catastrophic failure. It was the slow draining away of relevance, the gradual discovery that the world the lodge had been built for was no longer the world in which people actually lived. The British pattern mirrored the American. English Freemasonry, which had numbered over 500,000 at its peak, declined steadily through the second half of the 20th century. In Australia, in Canada, in the countries of Western Europe, the same curve appeared. A peak in the post-war decades, then a long, apparently irreversible decline. The question worth asking is not simply what went wrong, it is what the decline reveals about what the lodge had always actually been, and what it might yet become. The explanations are multiple, and they interact in ways that make it impossible to assign simple cause and effect. The first is structural. American Freemasonry, like most of the fraternal organizations that flourished in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, served partly as a social safety net. The lodge provided life insurance through collective savings, credit through informal lending networks, a guaranteed community of support for a man who moved to a new city or fell on hard times. As the American welfare state expanded, Social Security, Medicare, unemployment insurance, employer-provided health coverage, the practical necessity of belonging to a mutual aid society diminished. You no longer needed the lodge to ensure that your family would not starve if you died young. The government would do that, imperfectly, but reliably. The second explanation is temporal. Masonic membership required, and still requires, a substantial investment of time. Learning the rituals takes months. Advancing through the degrees takes years. Regular attendance at lodge meetings, which typically run 2 to 3 hours, often on weeknight evenings, competes with everything else that fills a modern life. Work that no longer ends at 5 o'clock. Families that require more sustained parental engagement than the mid-century norm expected. Entertainment options that are cheaper, more convenient, and require no memorization of elaborate ritual scripts. The third explanation is cultural. The post-war decades that produced Freemasonry's membership peak also produced the conditions of its decline. The counterculture of the 1960s, with its suspicion of institutions, its rejection of the conformist masculine ideal of the organization man, its challenge to the structures of authority that lodges like Freemasonry exemplified, drew a generation away from the kind of civic engagement the lodge represented. The sons of Freemasons looked at their fathers' aprons and saw something their fathers saw as dignity, and they saw something else entirely. The fourth explanation, the one that the lodges have been slowest to acknowledge, is gender. The New York World's Fair of 1964 had a Masonic Brotherhood Center. It had a pavilion designed to display the contributions of Freemasonry to American life. It had photographs of Masonic astronauts and Masonic presidents and Masonic cornerstones. It had a portrait gallery of famous brothers. Every face in that gallery was male. This was not an oversight. It was the condition of the institution. Freemasonry had been male since its founding in the stonemasons' lodges of medieval Scotland. The The constitutions of the Grand Lodge of England had been explicit on the point. Freemasonry was for free men, not for women. 3 centuries of tradition, ritual, and institutional inertia maintained that exclusion with the force of theological conviction. And yet the world in which that exclusion made social sense was disappearing rapidly. The women who had maintained the domestic routines that allowed their husbands to spend 3 evenings a month at lodge meetings were going back to school, entering the workforce, demanding an equal share of the unpaid labour of family life. The women who had accepted that civic engagement was a male prerogative were organising for political rights, professional recognition, and social equality. The family structure that had produced the lodge-going husband, one earner, one homemaker, clear and uncontested division of labour and leisure, was dissolving under economic and cultural pressures that no amount of Masonic ceremony could reverse. As women's professional and civic lives expanded, the argument that Freemasonry's male exclusivity was a neutral feature of its character became increasingly difficult to maintain. It began to look like what it had always at some level been, a structural expression of the assumption that public life, civic life, the life of institutions and ideas, was properly the domain of men. Some countries and some Grand Lodges responded to this reality by opening membership to women. France's Grand Orient admitted women to full and equal membership in 2010, after decades of pressure from female members of affiliated organisations. The English Grand Lodge has maintained its male exclusivity, while acknowledging the existence of parallel organisations, the Order of Women Freemasons, the Honourable Fraternity of Ancient Freemasons, that initiated women into the same rituals using the same symbolism. The debate about women in Freemasonry is, in miniature, the debate about Freemasonry's future. An institution that defines itself by exclusion, by the drawing of a boundary between those who are inside and those who are not, must constantly renegotiate where that boundary runs and why. The original exclusion of non-stonemasons had dissolved within decades of the lodge's founding. The exclusion of men of different classes and creeds had been theoretically dissolved by the constitutions of 1723. The exclusion of black men had been theoretically dissolved by Prince Hall in 1775, and only grudgingly acknowledged by the White Lodges nearly 2.5 centuries later. The exclusion of women is the last major boundary. The lodges that have crossed it report that the experience of mixed membership has not destroyed the lodge, it has revitalised it. The lodges that maintain the boundary offer, as their primary defence, the argument of tradition. It is the same argument that was made about every other boundary the Brotherhood has ever drawn. There is another force that has done more damage to the mystique of Freemasonry than any anti-Masonic movement, any papal bull, or any government persecution: the Internet. Within a decade of the World Wide Web's emergence as a mass medium, every significant Masonic secret had been posted, analysed, debated, and annotated online. The ritual texts that had been guarded for centuries, the oaths, the passwords, the ceremonial scripts for all 3 degrees and their higher degree extensions were available to anyone with a browser and a search engine. The famous handshakes were demonstrated on YouTube. The symbolism of the lodge was explained in more detail than most lodge members had ever received. The conspiracy theories multiplied at the same time. The Internet gave Masonic mythology an audience and a velocity it had never previously achieved. The Illuminati, that tiny, short-lived Bavarian secret society that had dissolved in 1787, acquired a digital afterlife that made it, paradoxically, more famous than it had been in its actual existence. Lady Gaga, Jay-Z, and Beyoncé were identified as Masonic agents. The eye on the dollar bill became the most analysed symbol in the history of graphic design. The architecture of Washington was mapped and remapped for hidden Masonic geometries. For the lodges, this was a double crisis. The secrets were gone, and the myths had taken their place. The secrets, as we have seen, were never the real substance of Freemasonry. They were the membrane around the substance, the boundary markers that defined the community and gave belonging its value. But they had served a practical social function. A man who joined the lodge to discover its secrets had to commit to the process of initiation, to the community of brothers, to the obligations of membership, before he received what he had come for. By the time he arrived at the altar for the 3rd degree, he was already, in some meaningful sense, a Freemason, shaped by the experience of becoming one. When the secrets are available on the Internet before a man ever walks into a lodge room, that process is short-circuited. The mystery is gone before the membership begins. What is left must be sufficient on its own: the community, the ritual experience, the moral framework, the brotherhood itself. These are not nothing, but they are harder to market than secrets. The conspiracy theories present a different problem. They are, in a sense, the ultimate tribute to the power of Masonic mythology, proof that the idea of a secret brotherhood controlling the world is still compelling enough to generate millions of search results and fill YouTube channels with hours of earnest analysis. But they make the actual work of recruiting thoughtful people into the actual lodge extremely difficult. A man who has spent 3 months watching videos about Masonic mind control is not a promising candidate for initiation. The lodge must compete, now, with its own mythology, and yet the lodge survives. Not in its 20th century form, not with its mid-century membership numbers, not with the cultural authority it enjoyed when a Masonic cornerstone ceremony was front-page news, but it survives. In over 100 countries, with somewhere between 6 and 7 million members worldwide, a fraction of its historical peak, but a number that still represents one of the largest voluntary fraternal organizations on earth. What draws men, and, in some jurisdictions, women, to the lodge in the 21st century is worth thinking about carefully, because it illuminates what the lodge has always actually offered beneath the mythology and the conspiracy theories and the historical drama. The men and women who join contemporary Masonic lodges are not, for the most part, joining because they believe in a tradition of ancient wisdom stretching back to Solomon's temple. They are not joining because they expect professional advantage or social preferment, though these were historically significant motivators and still operate in some contexts. They are not joining out of family obligation, though some, enough to be notable, join because a father or grandfather was a Mason and the connection matters to them. They are joining because they are looking for something that the contemporary world is remarkably bad at providing: community, ritual, seriousness, a space in which it is expected, rather than embarrassing, to take questions of moral life, how to be a good person, how to fulfill obligations to others, how to face difficulty with integrity, with genuine gravity. The contemporary world offers more entertainment, more information, more connection, and more choice than any previous era in human history. What it offers less of is precisely what the lodge was designed to supply: a face-to-face community of people who have made explicit commitments to one another, who meet regularly over years and decades, who mark the passages of each other's lives with ceremony, and who hold one another accountable to standards that are stated, repeated, and taken seriously. The lodge, at its best, is a practice, not a belief system, not a political organization, not a power network. A practice of showing up, of performing the ritual, of sitting with brothers, of trying, imperfectly, persistently, to be the kind of man the apron says you should be. None of this means that Freemasonry has resolved the contradictions that have defined it from the beginning. The racial division within American Freemasonry, the long, shameful story of white lodges refusing to recognize their black brothers, is not fully healed. As of the early 2020s, most American Grand Lodges have achieved formal mutual recognition with their Prince Hall counterparts. But the social reality of two parallel systems, shaped by 2 centuries of separation, does not dissolve with a resolution passed at a Grand Lodge meeting. The lodges share symbolic traditions and ritual language, but remain, in practice, largely separate communities. The question of women's membership remains unresolved in most of the world's Masonic jurisdictions. The arguments made against female membership in the 21st century are structurally identical to the arguments made against it in the 18th, and they are no more convincing now than they were then. The tension between the lodge's ideals and its human reality, between the brotherhood of the apron and the brotherhood of actual behavior, has not diminished. Masonic lodges have, at various points in their history, been used as vehicles for nepotism, corruption, racial exclusion, financial fraud, and political manipulation. The invocation of Masonic brotherhood as a reason to extend special treatment to a fellow Mason, in courts, in business, in politics, is a corruption of the lodge's stated principles that has occurred repeatedly and will almost certainly occur again. These are not reasons to dismiss Freemasonry. They are reasons to take it seriously, to hold it, as it holds itself, to its own standards. There is a moment in the third-degree ritual, the raising of Hiram Abif, when the candidate, having been lifted from the symbolic grave by the grip of the Master Mason, receives the substituted word. He is told that the true word, the word lost with Hiram's murder, the word that contains the fullness of Masonic knowledge, cannot be given to him. It was lost. It may one day be recovered, but not yet. This is, on one level, a piece of theatrical staging. But on another level, it is the most honest statement Freemasonry has ever made about itself. The Brotherhood has always been reaching for something it has not yet achieved: equality, and it has maintained hierarchies of race and gender, tolerance, and it has harboured bigotry. Brotherhood, and it has drawn boundaries. Virtue, and its members have been as capable of vice as any other collection of human beings. The lost word is not a piece of information. It is an aspiration. The gap between the aspiration and the reality is not a failure of Freemasonry. It is the condition of every institution that takes human ideals seriously, which is to say, every institution that is worth taking seriously at all. 400 years of Masonic history is, in this reading, a record not of achievement, but of striving. The achievement is real. The lodges that sustained communities through exclusion and persecution, the brothers who carried civil rights into courts and legislative chambers, the rituals that gave men a language for thinking about honour and obligation, the networks of mutual support that carried people through poverty and grief and loss. But the aspiration remains larger than the achievement, as it must if the institution is to remain alive. Somewhere tonight, in a lodge room in Edinburgh, or Lagos, or Sao Paulo, or Manila, in a building that might be a converted Victorian church, or a modern concrete block, or a rented upstairs room above a pub, a group of men is meeting. They are wearing aprons. They are performing rituals that are, in their basic structure, recognisably similar to the rituals performed in a Lisbon coffeehouse in 1743, in a Philadelphia tavern in 1758, in a Viennese lodge room in 1784. Some of them are meeting for the philosophy, some for the friendship, some because their fathers and grandfathers were Masons and the continuity matters to them, some because they are looking for something serious in a world that seems increasingly allergic to seriousness. Some, honestly, because the initiation ritual genuinely moved them, and they have not yet found words to explain exactly why. The man who has been asked to prove himself tonight will be blindfolded. He will have a cord placed around his neck. He will be led through a door into a room he cannot see, and he will be asked to stand before a community of men who have agreed to judge him by his character rather than his history. He will swear an oath on a sacred text, promising to keep the secrets of the Brotherhood and to come to the aid of his brothers. He will be told what the secrets are, and he will understand, perhaps immediately or perhaps only years later, what John Kustos understood in a Lisbon dungeon almost 3 centuries ago. The secret was never the point. The point was the commitment. The point was the room. The point was standing in the dark, reaching out your hand, and finding that someone was there to take it. That is what Freemasonry has always been, beneath the mythology and the scandal and the 400 years of history. That is what it remains. Whether it is enough to carry the Brotherhood through the next 400 years is a question that only the men, and perhaps, eventually, the women who walk through that door will answer. The lodge is waiting. The door is open.